Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
Next to Jack is my friend Barbara Reynolds. Reverend Reynolds is a former columnist, USA Today reporter for the Chicago Tribune, an ordained minister, an adjunct professor at the Howard University School of Divinity, author of several books, including an award-winning biography of Reverend Jesse Jackson, a good friend of Coretta Scott King, the late Coretta Scott King, who did so much to preserve the civil rights movement. Thank you. Barbara?
Well, I was in the civil rights movement. I never will forget working in Tennessee, Brownsville, Tennessee, trying to register blacks to vote. And, we almost got killed in Brownsville, Tennessee. There were roadblocks, and I was very naive, born in Columbus, Ohio, didn't understand racism at that level, that someone would try to kill me just because I was black. So in Brownsville, Tennessee, when it almost happened, I began to understand racism from a very visceral level, that someone would really kill me because I did not look like a white person. Later, as a reporter with the Chicago Tribune, I was in '69. I was called to the home of Mark Clark and Fred Hampton. I had known Fred Hampton, who was a member of the Black Panther Party. He was a pretty nice guy, I thought. He would have been a lawyer, he said. He was a member of the NAACP, but he was also a Black Panther. I walked in his blood. I walked in on the door on the west side of Chicago. There was blood on the floor, blood on the mattress, blood everywhere, 100 bullet holes in the wall. At that time in my young life, I thought there would be such a thing as justice for people who did wrong things, because whatever he had done in this system of justice, we're supposed to have trials, but he was assassinated. So in my young life, I thought justice would happen, that people would pay for their crimes. It didn't happen. The people in Hanrahan and the people who shot him down, they still walked around. There was no justice. So when Rodney King happened, I had learned that there's still much to do, because we still have to be on the battlefield for justice. Then there was Abdou Diallo, who put his wallet up, and the police shot him over, I guess, 18, 20, 21, 30 times. So as a child of the civil rights movement who almost died just trying to be a human being, to see the progress now, and of course the lack of progress, where people could look at Katrina people and call them refugees, that a government could look at people like that were Americans and just go on with business as usual. So I saw it, I was a part of it, and I'm still hoping that I can live to see a day when we all can be treated as human beings.
Thanks, Barbara.
Context of White Supremacy, Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, April 14th, 2017. So I have been told this is our third study session on the late Mrs. Coretta Scott King, her autobiography as told to Reverend Dr. Barbara Reynolds, My Life, My Love, My Legacy. Our third study session, we're picking up on Chapter 6 right at the beginning. The audio segment we started off this week, that is Dr. Reynolds. I thought it was important to include some of her commentary as we move along. The first two intros were Mrs. King speaking directly, but that was Dr. Reynolds. I thought that was important because she is an acclaimed journalist. She covered a lot of the civil rights movement. That's why she has this relationship with Mrs. King, why Mrs. King trusted her to partner in putting her autobiography together. And I think that is a huge factor in why this book is so good. And I thought it was important, correct, to include some of her commentary and insight, just who she is as a person, as a writer, that I think also is a great part of the story, the fabric, the richness of this text. Without further ado, I will step aside. We will get to the text again, Chapter 6. This is the autobiography of the late Mrs. Coretta Scott King, My Life, My Love, My Legacy, as told to Reverend Dr. Barbara Reynolds. Audio segment number 1.
6. The Winds of Change. An oft-heard refrain in black churches is, I got up one morning, my hands looked new. I looked at my feet, and they did too. Everything was brand new. That was the way it felt in the wake of the successful Montgomery Bus Boycott. The new year, 1957, dawned as a metaphor for a future that sparkled and gleamed with promise, potential, and fresh purpose. The days reminded me of the touch of lime with which I like to flavor my sweet tea. How you could enjoy sweetness with a hint of bitterness, a reminder that life often brings both. On February 18, 1957, Time magazine featured Martin on its cover, with a story about how he was emerging as one of the nation's remarkable leaders. It was a great honor, but being thrust into the national spotlight brought with it a new set of uncertainties and challenges. I had many questions, and I was seeking direction about what awaited me around the corner. Could I continue my career as a concert singer? Should I be expected to become a public speaker? How could I balance being there for Martin and being home with the children and being deeply involved in the movement? How could I compartmentalize myself in so many ways and still hold on to the corner of my life that belonged strictly to Coretta? I soon found that there was no map or guidebook to help me answer my questions. I had to live life and believe that God would define me and shape me for my purpose. I began to understand that each crisis, even each new heartache, was just preparation for the leadership role that I would have in the coming years. Martin's recognition in the mainstream media had resulted in his being celebrated as the ex officio president of Black America, with requests for him to speak pouring in from around the nation and the world. While I was overjoyed at the opportunities Martin had to be a messenger for such a great cause, for me the notoriety also came with a price, like threats and harassment, and the fact that Martin could be detained at any moment. Martin had been jailed for the first time, so I now knew how that felt. How anxiety is like rocks piling up in the pit of your stomach, and you wake up every hour in anticipation of bad news. Strangely enough, I so identified with Martin's suffering that I vicariously felt the weight of prison doors slamming behind me, too. When he was locked in, I felt locked out of his life, not knowing if he would return to his family alive or with his body broken. I understood what it meant to feel helpless and hopeful at the same time. Nevertheless, life had a hold of me, and I became swept up in the strong currents of the movement as it rushed forward. Encouraged by the success of the Montgomery experience, other churches and colleges began planning protests and sit-ins to end segregation. Martin and his team of ministers soon understood that the problems of segregation were so deeply ingrained in Southern soil that full equality could come only through changes in the law, or more precisely, federal intervention, which would mean increasing our efforts to organize and mobilize. On January 10, 1957, I found myself thrust in the midst of the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I opened and presided over the first meeting of the body that would eventually become the SCLC. Martin had sent invitations to nearly 100 leaders in states across the South, asking them to attend the 2-day meeting at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Our aim was to coordinate all the fast-moving activities swirling around racial injustice and broaden the movement's base. Martin and Ralph had planned to open the meetings, but in the wee hours of that morning they had to rush back to Montgomery because Ralph's home and church had been bombed, as had 3 other black churches, and the home of Pastor Robert Grates, the white pastor of a black Lutheran church, the only white person to serve on the MIA board. So Martin delegated to me the historic task of calling the august group together. I took this as one more sign that eventually I would have to expand my role from being a concert singer to also becoming a public speaker, a role I eyed with trepidation. About a month later, on Valentine's Day, 1957, the SCLC was officially founded in New Orleans. However, it was headquartered in Atlanta because Atlanta was a hub of transportation in the South. Ella Baker was its first acting executive secretary. Ralph Abernathy was elected treasurer. Martin was elected president. Practically all the leaders who answered the call and attended our first meetings were ministers, underscoring our commission as a Christian-oriented, nonviolent movement. Although the members of the SCLC were often labeled passive resistors, that was a serious misnomer. As I stressed at our first meeting, we organized as a militant organization that believed that the most potent weapon available was nonviolent social action. From the moment of the SCLC's inception, I had high hopes for its success. I saw tremendously seasoned and courageous men stepping forward to work with the organization. These leaders included the Reverend C.K. Steele, eminent pastor of the Bethel Baptist Church in Tallahassee, who became the leader of the Tallahassee bus boycott and movement, the Reverend Joseph E. Lowry, who launched the Mobile movement, and the Reverend Fred Lee Shuttlesworth, a civil rights leader in Birmingham. It was Shuttlesworth who became a symbol of the Southern struggle as he fought the tyranny of the infamous Bull Connor, the Commissioner of Public Safety in Birmingham. With matters being organized, broadened, and placed in the hands of able leaders, Martin and I took some time off to rest and to travel internationally. When I reflect on the years immediately following Montgomery, I think on those things that took me away from it. It was as if some other part of my life had to be broadened through travel, meeting foreign dignitaries, and witnessing the experiences of other activists and oppressed people around the globe. Some 30 years later, I would serve a brief ambassadorship in the United Nations, and as a private citizen, I would serve as a goodwill ambassador to many nations of the world. Periodically, my conscience and sense of moral integrity would force me to take public stands against the official foreign policy of my government. These early years traveling with Martin to foreign shores were my prep school. Many invitations poured in for me and Martin to visit nations around the world, but the first we accepted was the opportunity to witness Ghana become one of the first African colonies to gain independence from the United Kingdom. Not only were the chains coming off in our country, but Africa was breaking free as well. You can imagine the excitement Martin and I felt after seeing a new movement being birthed in the South. Now we could witness the winds of change stirring in Africa, too. The two struggles, against colonialism in Africa and racial oppression in America, were tributaries of the same river. So we felt honored that Kwame Nkrumah, head of the government-elect of Ghana, invited us to celebrate the birth of their new black nation. After many years of black struggle, the British Empire finally concluded that it could no longer rule the Gold Coast. It agreed to free Ghana on March 6, 1957. All this was because of the persistent protests of those who no longer wanted to be bound. Nkrumah himself had been arrested for sedition and sentenced to several years, but just as the jailers in America were forced to let Martin out of jail because of the movement's protests, the British had to handle Nkrumah gently. He served only 9 months and came out of prison the new prime minister. On March 3, 1957, Martin and I boarded a plane to Accra to be present at the birth of Ghana's independence. Nkrumah had invited a number of prominent black American leaders, including Ralph Bunche, Lester Granger of the Urban League, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., A. Philip Randolph, and NAACP Chief Roy Wilkins. Chief Minister Norman Washington Manley, the founding father of Jamaica, was also there. People came from 70 nations to witness this African country's break from European colonial rule. At a reception on March 4th, Martin met Richard Nixon, who was vice president at that time. He greeted Martin warmly. "You're Dr. King. I recognized you from your picture on the cover of Time. That was a mighty fine story about you. I'd like to meet with you when you are back in Washington." On March 5th, we watched the closing of the last meeting of the Parliament under British rule. The British, most of whom were white, were dressed in business suits, and the parliamentary officials wore traditional white curled wigs and black robes. Nkrumah and his ministers wore the prison caps that had been part of their uniforms during imprisonment. Those caps held special significance for me. They were a reminder of my deep pain the first time I saw Martin jailed, and they hinted at the many other heartbreaks over jailings I was sure would come. At midnight, the bells of Accra began to toll, and we stepped out of Parliament and were greeted by the sight of a great crowd, more than 50,000 people cheering wildly. We watched the Union Jack with its triple crosses of red, blue, and white ease down the flagpole. We saw the red, yellow, and green flag of Ghana, a new, free nation, rise up. Then Nkrumah, speaking in English, said, "At long last, the battle has ended. Ghana, our beloved country, is free forever. Let us pause 1 minute to give thanks to our Almighty God." Breaking the silence, there was a mighty roar as thousands chanted in unison, "Ghana is free." I looked at Martin and saw that he was weeping with joy. Like many African Americans who were not free to eat, live, or work where they wanted, I identified strongly with the Ghanaians. At so many places in the South, I could still not be served a hot dog unless I waited at the back door. I could not stay in a first-rate hotel. I could not try on a dress in a downtown department store. I could not check out a book from a public library. In Ghana, it was exhilarating to see black people in charge. For the first time, I was in a situation in which black people were the majority in a land they could call their own. What an impact! It gave me such a great sense of pride. I thought about our own situation. How long would it be before we, too, could be freed from our oppression and become full-fledged Americans? The Ghanaian experience was a great boost to our dreams of one day seeing blacks control their own destiny in America. It was also quite a thrill for me to see how Martin was recognized in Ghana and in the other places we traveled, Nigeria, Rome, Geneva, Paris, and London, as we made our way home. 2 years later, Martin and I took our second trip off of American soil, journeying to India to study the teachings of Mohandas K. Gandhi, the man who had made such an impact on our movement, who was the guiding light for our ideology and our techniques of nonviolent social change. I found it a wonderful twist of fate that the activist Bayard Rustin, head of the War Resisters League, who had spoken about India to my 8th grade class in Marion, Alabama, and later at Antioch, had signed on as one of my husband's mentors for the trip. Rustin, a hardcore Gandhian, had spent 6 months in India and was active in its independent political movement. Rustin's speech on the tactics of Gandhi, coupled with independent study, had whetted my interest in the effectiveness of nonviolence. Meanwhile, ever since his studies at Crozier Seminary, Martin had been pursuing the Gandhian doctrine of strikes, marches, boycotts, and other nonviolent demonstrations to achieve justice. Martin was first exposed to Gandhi's works when he attended a lecture by Dr. Mordecai Johnson, the first black president of Howard University. After hearing Dr. Johnson speak, Martin bought every book he could find on Gandhi's success as a leader and a proponent of nonviolence. Gandhi's nonviolent strategies resonated with Martin's deeply ingrained Christian ethics. Gandhi, of course, is widely celebrated as the father of Indian independence. His hunger strikes, imprisonments, and nonviolent protests were so effective with the masses that Britain left India, one of its largest and most profitable colonies, in 1947. Tragically, Gandhi was assassinated just a year later, on January 30th, 1948. As I studied the life of Gandhi closely, I wondered if Martin, who patterned himself after Gandhi, would face a similar tragedy. I know my husband had similar thoughts. After our trip abroad, Martin wrote a piece about Gandhi that could have been a self-portrait. All one had to do was scratch out the name Gandhi and insert Martin Luther King. Martin wrote, "The world doesn't like people like Gandhi. They don't like people like Christ. They don't like people like Abraham Lincoln. They kill them. And this man who had done all of that for India, who had given his life and who mobilized and galvanized 400 million people for independence, here was a man of nonviolence falling at the hands of a man of violence. Here was a man of love falling at the hands of a man of hate. This seems the way of history." As we took off for India, a transportation tie-up temporarily diverted us from our main destination, New Delhi, to Bombay. To my shock, we saw thousands of people dressed in rags sleeping on the sidewalk or huddled in doorways, lying wherever they could find space. Some carried everything they owned wrapped up in rags or newspapers. The legions of emaciated human beings picking through garbage, some wearing only dirty loincloths, were, our guides explained to me, a byproduct of colonialism. Not even in Africa had we seen such poverty. Yet, despite the degrading living conditions, the crime rate was surprisingly low in contrast to that in the poorer areas of the United States. In marked contrast to the suffering we saw in Bombay, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's palatial residence in New Delhi was as lavish as it was gracious. Over dinner, we were able to learn firsthand the difference in policy and philosophy Nehru had had with Mahatma Gandhi. We knew from our studies and from friends about the policy battles between the two. Gandhi had been completely dedicated to nonviolence, while Nehru was inclined to accept it as a useful revolutionary technique. Gandhi, a practitioner of the simple life, had not wished to turn India into a modern technological society. Nehru, who was more Western-oriented, felt that India could not survive without becoming industrialized. It would be interesting if the two leaders could have had this conversation today, in the early 21st century, as India and its neighbor Pakistan continue to develop their nuclear armaments. After dinner, Nehru took us up a broad flight of stairs and into a formal sitting room to meet his daughter, Indira Gandhi, who was no relation to Mohandas Gandhi. This was a high point of my pilgrimage. From that first meeting, Indira and I became friends, enjoying a friendship that endured up to her tragic assassination in 1984. Indira would later serve as Prime Minister of India from 1966 to 1977 and from 1980 to 1984, becoming one of the first women in modern history, along with Israel's Golda Meir, to lead her nation. I was so impressed with Indira's charm, grace, and intellect, and by watching her up close, I came to understand some of the strengths and perils of women at the top, particularly the ways that women can be condemned for doing exactly the same things for which their male predecessors are praised. On the brighter side, however, as early as the 1950s, and partially because of Mahatma Gandhi's commitment to the advancement of women, I saw how some Indian women held much higher positions than women back home. There were women in Parliament, and in 1959, a woman was even a justice in India's high courts. Imagine that! I know that someday, women in the United States will lead the country, not only in one of the highest courts of the land, but also at the top, as president. It would be wonderful if I could live to see that come to pass. Lady Mountbatten, the wife of Lord Mountbatten, Viceroy of India, was also a guest of Nehru's that night. The Mountbattens and Nehru, who held opposing ideologies, could have been bitter enemies, yet they remained friends because of Gandhi's policy of love and nonviolence, in which the main objective and ideal aftermath of a nonviolent revolution is reconciliation and the creation of the beloved community. When the battles are over, the refusal of the activists to engage in hate or hostility can produce a new relationship of friendship between the oppressed and the oppressor. During our trip, we also met with leaders advancing the cause of the so-called untouchables, a term drawn from the caste system that had existed in India for generations. The untouchable, or Dalit, status is traditionally associated with occupations regarded as ritually impure, such as butchering, removal of waste, or leather work. Dalits work as manual laborers, cleaning latrines and sewers and clearing away rubbish. Engaging in such activities was thought to pollute the individual, and this pollution was considered contagious. As a result, Dalits were segregated and banned from full participation in Hindu social life. For example, they could not enter a temple or a school, and were required to stay outside the village. To learn more about the untouchables, Martin and I journeyed to one of the southernmost parts of India, the city of Trivandrum, in the state of Kerala, where Martin spoke at a school attended by students who, with government help, were attempting to emerge from the caste system. They had no running water. Many didn't have beds to sleep in. This was counter to what Gandhi would have wanted. He would not have given his life to free India from British political domination and economic exploitation, only for his countrymen to trample more than 100 million of their brothers and sisters underfoot. Through his many nonviolent campaigns, such as fasting almost to the death, barriers that had existed for thousands of years had fallen, but the issue of the untouchables was still a struggle within India. With that bit of history in mind, when Martin spoke at the school, he drew upon the parallels between the situation in India and with black Americans in the United States. I am an untouchable, and every Negro in America is an untouchable. Nehru had told Martin and me how, because of the climate set by Gandhi, federal laws banned discrimination against the untouchables, and the Indian Constitution had made violation of that law a crime punishable by imprisonment. The Indian government spent millions of rupees annually developing housing and job opportunities in villages heavily populated by untouchables. In addition, the Prime Minister said, if two applicants competed for entrance to a college or university, and one of the applicants was an untouchable, while the other was of a higher caste, the school was obligated to take the untouchable. In my understanding, Nehru's reformist policy sounded much like the policy at home, which was being called affirmative action. However, the Prime Minister saw it as a way of atoning for the centuries of injustice and suffering inflicted upon the untouchables. We found it disheartening that in India, everyone from the Prime Minister down to the village councilman had come to the conclusion, at least publicly, that declaring an ethnic group inferior was wrong. Yet in America, segregationists such as George Wallace won elections by declaring their opposition to policies intended to foster equality for America's untouchables. As Martin made speeches all across India stressing the debt America owed to Gandhian philosophy, I often sang on the same program. The Indians had a great love of Negro spirituals. As time went on, I sang as much as Martin lectured. Because the press in India had given our 381-day Montgomery Bus Boycott more comprehensive coverage than many publications in America, Martin had instant face recognition. Wherever we went, we were besieged by autograph seekers. We held press conferences in all the larger cities, from Delhi to Calcutta and Madras to Bombay. Martin and I left India more convinced than ever that nonviolent resistance was the most potent weapon available to a minority group in its struggle for equality. What we had witnessed was the amazing climax of a nonviolent campaign. I had high hopes that our revolution would also reap a great harvest, and I fought my fears, trying to believe that Martin himself would live to see it. After we returned home, I saw the effect of Martin's identification with the asceticism practiced by Gandhi. Like Gandhi, my husband had struggled with the issue of materialism. In his writings, Gandhi challenged the cultural condition that deemed his wife and children possessions. He often questioned how even a cupboard full of books might be excessive, because his spirituality compelled him to give up all that he had. For me, that brand of asceticism was more than I had expected in our marriage, and it was more than I could accept. If Martin had had his way, he would have taken an oath of poverty, refusing even the most basic necessities, such as a house. He felt that much of the corruption in society came from the desire to acquire material things such as houses, land, and cars. He wanted none of these, he said, telling me once, "You know, a man who dedicates himself to a cause doesn't need a family." That statement did not hurt me, because I knew he was searching for a balance between asceticism and materialism. But I insisted that our family have a house, nothing fancy, but at least the basics. It took almost 13 years of marriage before he agreed to buy a house, and when he did, he said he didn't need it. It was for me and the children. Finally, he decided that cars and a home were necessities, though he would strive to be more like Gandhi spiritually, adopting disciplines such as fasting in order to gain spiritual strength. Still, our house and car were in my name. He refused to own anything. And he never took to the pretentious habit of hiring chauffeured limousines or fancy cars. He would much rather drive a Ford than a Cadillac. Also, he wanted to have a house in a low-income neighborhood, and he wanted his children to grow up understanding the least of these. I didn't have a problem with that. I just wanted a house. Every woman wants a house. Unlike Martin, I never sought out asceticism as a way of life. But like Martin, I never became a captive of materialism. The travels Martin and I experienced together afforded us a chance to connect with world leaders, to get more than a textbook understanding of the developing nations of the world, and just as important, they helped us achieve balance in our lives. The travels, it seemed, served as a device to lift us up from the fire and to cool us down from the overload of movement demands, which sometimes pushed Martin to the point of exhaustion. The cooling-off period, however, never lasted long. While I tried not to feel apprehensive, it did seem as though each calm was followed by another storm. After every high point, evil lurked around the corner. 7. I will never turn back. Our trip to Ghana was life-changing for Martin and me for a variety of reasons, one of which is that it was there that I realized I was pregnant with our second child. On the way from Accra to Kano, Nigeria, I began to experience morning sickness. The scents from the marketplaces left a heavy, putrid smell in my nostrils that exacerbated it. I felt nauseated, but said little, preferring to wait until a private moment to share with Martin the news he had been longing to hear. Once again, we would celebrate the birth of new life. We had lengthy debates over the naming of our first boy. I hesitated to name him after Martin. Martin was rising to prominence, and I sensed that the name of a famous father might be a crushing identity to carry. Nevertheless, on October 23, 1957, my son was born and named Martin Luther King III. At that time, I tried to curtail many of my activities to stay home with my 2 children. I always felt that if I failed at being a good mother, whatever else I did would not much matter. However, I soon learned that my resolve to function as a stay-at-home mother would constantly be interrupted by knocks at my door. At times, I yielded to the church mother's constant requests to babysit my babies. I realize how nervous it made me feel the few times I had to be away, and how it made the mothers who babysat Yoki and Marty even more nervous when they answered the phone to, "Hi, it's Mrs. King again." In addition to helping with civil rights efforts, I also still felt an inner stirring to return to the concert stage. Music was such a part of me, I could not let it go. Moreover, I could see its value for the movement. Music was an opportunity not only to drive home a message, but also to change minds. I returned to the stage on April 25, 1958 at Parker High School in Birmingham, at a program sponsored by Alpha Phi Alpha, my husband's fraternity. I continued the format I had developed, using dramatic storytelling mixed with songs to tell the story of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. I saw how these kinds of performances were excellent fundraisers for the movement, while giving me the personal satisfaction that came from using the arts to influence minds and hearts. I had always preferred to sing and leave public speaking to Martin. Yet sometimes he would push me forward to represent him when he was tied up with other business. I agonized over the shift in our roles at such times. Should I not stay where I was comfortable as a singer and further perfect that craft instead of doing something that seemed like trying to walk on eggshells? I settled the issue of whether I could make the shift from concert stage to public speaker's podium on March 9, 1958. When I was invited to deliver the annual Women's Day address at the New Hope Baptist Church in Denver, Colorado. A dear friend of ours, the Reverend M.C. Williams, was the pastor. I spent hours preparing my message while traveling from Montgomery to Atlanta by train and on to Denver by plane. I arrived in Denver on a Friday and spent that evening and a good part of Saturday polishing my speech. Realizing the importance and seriousness of what I was about to do, I also spent much time in prayer and meditation. In the final version, I used the Book of Esther to present my theme. I will never turn back, and if I perish, I perish. The Book of Esther is one of my favorites in the Bible. It is a study of how God used an orphaned Jewish girl in Persia to save his people after the evil Haman, the king's second-in-command, targeted the Jews for destruction. Esther was one of the unlikeliest people to be used in the grand scheme of shaping a nation, but through her courage, the Jews were saved. I love the line in which she comes to understand that she was brought to the kingdom for a time such as this, even though taking a stand was against the law. And if I perish, she vowed. In delivering that message, the words of Horace Mann, the first president of Antioch College, were still alive within me. He encouraged his students by telling us that we should be ashamed to die until we had won some victory for humanity. That April, for the first time, I publicly gave voice to the vision and path I believed God had put me on. There were times in my life going forward when I had to brace myself with the mantra, "If I perish, to find the strength to press on. That night, I knew God was with me because when I rose to speak, I felt the most powerful sense of his presence. I knew I had not been called to preach like Martin, but in many ways I felt I was preaching my trial sermon. After my presentation, 3 people came forward to give their lives to Christ. Their response settled the question of whether I should step forth as a public speaker as well as a singer. It was for me a truly unforgettable moment, infused with joy, resolve, and purpose. In the wake of that pivotal moment, life continued on a high. Martin and I continued to travel and devote ourselves to organizing. Everywhere we went, people recognized Martin from the exposure he had received on the cover of Time magazine. As I feared, though, that notoriety attracted more harm to him, and not always from the hands of whites. As bad as the racial environment was in the South, I never felt that any one race had a monopoly on evil, and the specter of violence always hovered around us. I worried about Martin incessantly when he was away from home, and always dreaded that call, like the one that came on September 20th, 1958, from Dr. O. Clay Maxwell of the Mount Olivet Baptist Church in New York City, a family friend. After a short greeting, he said gently, "Mrs. King, I want you to prepare yourself. I have some bad news for you." Instantly my heart raced. Was this the news I had feared for so long? "Is he dead?" I asked immediately. "He's alive, but it's serious," Dr. Maxwell said. He went on to explain what had happened. A demented black woman had stabbed Martin as he was autographing his newly released book, Stride Toward Freedom. Because of the way the weapon had been inserted, the surgeon had to remove it by making 2 incisions, leaving a cross-shaped scar on Martin's chest. As soon as we could arrange a flight, Ralph, Christine, and I flew from Atlanta, arriving in New York at daybreak the next morning. Reverend Thomas Kilgore of the Friendship Baptist Church of New York City, Bayard Rustin, Stanley Levison, and Ella Baker met us at the airport. They shook with nerves as they shared the gory details. Martin had been autographing books at a table in the shoe department of Bloomstein's department store when a black woman came up to him and asked, "Are you Dr. King?" He answered, "Yes, I am." Mrs. Isola Ware Curry, a 42-year-old woman, then said in a voice dripping with anger, "Luther King, I have been after you for 5 years." In the next second, my husband felt something sharp plunge forcefully into his chest. Someone grabbed the woman, another tried to take out the weapon, but Martin had the presence of mind to stop him. He told me later that he felt no great pain at first, but realized, because of the position of the weapon, that the wound could be fatal. Martin was rushed by ambulance to Harlem Hospital, where he lay in bed for hours while preparations were made to remove the blade from his chest. At first we were anxious about the delay, but then we learned the reason. Dr. Aubrey Maynard, the chief of surgery who performed the operation, told me that the razor tip of the blade had been touching Martin's aorta, and that his whole chest had to be opened to remove it. "If you had sneezed during all those hours of waiting," Dr. Maynard told Martin, "your aorta would have been punctured, and you would have drowned in your own blood." Later, the New York Times summarized, "If Martin had sneezed, he would have died." The doctors told us what a remarkable, fearless person Martin was. How many of us would have reacted if we had looked down and seen a blade sticking out of our chests? Panic and fear, certainly. Maybe we would even have tried to remove it. Any of those choices could have been fatal. The doctor said Martin's calmness helped save his life. Later, my husband wrote for his column in Ebony magazine, "If I demonstrated unusual calm, it was not due to any extraordinary power that I possess. Rather, it was due to the power of God working through me. Throughout this struggle for racial justice, I have constantly asked God to remove all bitterness from my heart and to give me the strength and courage to face any disaster that came my way. This constant prayer life and trust in God have given me the feeling that I have divine companionship in the struggle." Reflecting on why a nonviolent person became the victim of such violence, he commented, "To believe in nonviolence does not mean that violence will not be inflicted upon you. The believer in nonviolence is the person who will willingly allow himself to be the victim of violence, but will never inflict violence upon another. He lives by the conviction that through his suffering and cross-bearing, the social situation may be redeemed." It was heartbreaking for me to see Martin plugged into so many tubes. One minute he was perfectly healthy, the next perfectly helpless. During the many nights I sat in Harlem Hospital, I tried to make sense of what had happened and to reflect on it with spiritual curiosity. Was this a trial? A test of some kind? I thought of the crowds that always followed Martin, for their love of him and what he stood for. On one hand, it was like Palm Sunday, when Christ went to Jerusalem and the people glorified him. On the other hand, the experience of the stabbing was somewhat like Gethsemane, a dark and arduous period during which maybe not only my husband was being tested, but his followers as well. including me. I often heard Martin speak of being able to accept a blow without striking back. As I sat by his hospital bed, I began to understand that now was our chance to put our beliefs into action. As soon as Martin was able to speak, he issued a statement. "This person needs help. She is not responsible for the violence she has done me. Don't prosecute her. Get her healed." Eventually, Mrs. Curry was committed to an institution for the criminally insane. I never held any bitterness against her. Rather, I believe her act helped prepare us for a deeper appreciation of the struggle. During that time of wounding, we saw how blacks and whites around the world cared for Martin. Letters and cards poured in from everywhere. Worshippers in churches and synagogues prayed for his recovery. Even during this most painful moment, we saw how our movement was touching hearts and minds around the world, and that was more than enough to emblaze our desires, to show us that somehow we were on the right course. As activists, we were also learning the true meaning of a phrase found in the biblical story of Joseph, which is a staple in Christian circles. What the devil meant for evil, God changed it for good. 8. Pushed to the breaking point. Violence and oppression take many forms, and the form that took its toll on me was Martin's repeated, unwarranted arrests, which reached truly disruptive and dispiriting proportions in 1960, leaving me pushed to the breaking point. I felt so alone and vulnerable. I had tried to control my emotions and tie down my feelings, but I felt I could stomach no more. The feeling of losing my grip on life was not normal for me. As much as my ability to cope with tragedy had surprised me, this sudden sense of weakness startled me even more. Overall, Martin's imprisonments, in which he would be joined by thousands of young people, seniors, colleagues, clergy, blacks and whites, became one of the most effective tools in nonviolent warfare. Martin saw jailing as the ultimate refusal to cooperate with evil and unjust laws, the unwillingness to comply, adjust, or compromise. It meant surrendering your body to be put in chains, while allowing your spirit, your soul, and your sense of right to reign free. Gandhi, Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, Apostle Paul, and Jesus Christ himself all surrendered their bodies to their jailers, and in many ways, large and small, forever changed the face of history through their suffering and sacrifices. From the lessons of history, I understood how, under the right circumstances, jail-going as part of a struggle for freedom can be a positive force for change. I understood this from a historical and intellectual context, but also from a personal standpoint, given my own suffering at seeing Martin alone and in danger behind bars, to the extent that I wondered how much more I could bear. Moreover, it was left to me to help our small children counter the teasing from other children who said their daddy was a jailbird. I tried to make my children understand that Martin was not behind bars because he had done something wrong, but because he was trying to make things right for others. I said to Yoki, who was then 5, and Marty, who was 3, "Your daddy went to jail to help people. Some people don't have enough to eat, nor do they have comfortable homes to live in or enough clothing to wear. He goes to jail to make things better." I felt it was important for them to see his jail-going as a badge of honor. To return to the beginning of the story, in January 1960, Martin resigned from Dexter Baptist Church after a momentous ceremony, and we moved from Montgomery to a rented house in Atlanta. There, Martin became co-pastor with Daddy King at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Before we could get settled, though, on February 17, 1960, Martin was charged with falsifying his state income taxes in Alabama. The implication was that he had taken money from the movement and not accounted for it. The auditors said that he had claimed a brand new station wagon and an air conditioner for our home, yet we had neither. Rather than detracting from Martin's character as intended, the trumped-up charges were correctly viewed by the movement's supporters as harassment. This lesson was not lost on Martin's enemies. who understood that if character assassination did not work, other more lethal weapons were available. Although Martin was innocent, the weight of the unwarranted charge sent him into a depression. He confided in me his fear that he would be trying to prove his innocence for the rest of his life. Martin and I had little hope of justice, but in a surprising development on May 28th, a Southern jury of 12 white men acquitted him. Only then did Martin stop beating himself up about the charges. Shortly afterward, a cross was burned on our front lawn in Atlanta, but even that did not steal our joy or mar our victory. We did not have long to celebrate. 5 months later, Martin and 280 people were charged with staging a sit-in demonstration to integrate Atlanta lunch counters. The charges were almost immediately dropped for most of the demonstrators, but Martin was detained and indicted for violating probation on an earlier traffic offense. The trouble had started back in May when he was transporting Lillian Smith, a well-known Southern writer, to Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, where she was undergoing cancer treatment. A policeman, no doubt noting that the woman was white, pulled Martin over and gave him a summons for driving with an out-of-state license. This happened in DeKalb County, a suburb of Atlanta which was Klan country. When Martin went to court the next day to face the traffic license citation, a judge named Oscar Mitchell fined him $25, and although Martin's lawyer didn't disclose this detail to Martin, placed him on probation for 6 months. Later, in October, as Martin was being released from the sit-in charges in Atlanta, DeKalb County officials came and arrested him on the grounds that he had violated his probation from the earlier traffic license offense by participating in the sit-in. A hearing was set for 3 days later, during which time Martin remained behind bars. I attended the hearing at the DeKalb County Courthouse, along with Martin's sister, Christine, his brother, A.D., and Daddy King. Because the offense was minor, we were dumbfounded when Judge Oscar Mitchell denied bail and sentenced Martin to 4 months of hard labor on a state road gang at Georgia State Prison, a maximum security prison in Reidsville. It was such a shock that Christine burst into tears. When I saw her crying, I could not hold back my own tears. All through the movement, I had held myself together, but on that day, partially because of the shock of the sentence and the fact that Martin had been in jail for a week prior, I broke down. I was also 5 months pregnant with our 3rd child, which I am certain aggravated my feelings. Daddy King was upset himself, but he scolded me for crying. "You don't see Daddy crying," he told me. "I am not taking this lying down. I have to hold up for my wife, hold up for my daughter-in-law and my daughter." I felt helpless and alone. I was worried that our baby would be born while Martin was in jail, and I was worried about how Martin would fare without the usual companionship of Ralph Abernathy, who had become his regular cellmate. I was also told that if Martin were made to work on a state chain gang, he would be exposed to anyone who wanted to take a shot at him. In the climate we faced, Martin had to be freed, or he would likely face death. Try as I might, I could not erase my knowledge of the years of history, of what could happen to black people in the South at the hands of Southern whites. It had only been 5 short years since the brutal murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till, who was beaten and killed while visiting relatives in Mississippi. The national news coverage of the funeral and the open casket showing Till's disfigured body added to the fear that no black person was safe in the South, especially one with the notoriety of my husband. I watched in horror as Martin was immediately taken from the courtroom, his hands in metal cuffs behind his back. When Daddy King, Christine, A.D., and I were allowed to see him for a few moments, I couldn't stop the tears from streaming down my face. When Martin saw me crying, he said, "Corey, I have never seen you like this before. You have to hold up for me." He asked me for newspapers, magazines, and some money. I tried to pull myself together, to return home and gather his things, and to take care of our children. The lawyer filed a writ of habeas corpus, asking the judge to hold a hearing the next day, which would grant bail for Martin instead of sending him to jail. I was getting ready to go to court when I got a call with terrible news. In the middle of the night, several men came to Martin's cell, shone a flashlight in his face, and ordered him to get up. Martin later told me that the terrors of Southern justice, wherein scores of black men were plucked from their cells and never seen again, ran through his mind as the men made him dress, handcuffed him very tightly, and chained him all the way down to his legs. They then placed him in the back of a patrol car, along with a large German shepherd. During the 230-mile night ride through rural Georgia, the men didn't tell Martin where he was going. That kind of mental anguish is worse than dying, Martin wrote about the experience. Riding for mile after mile, hungry and thirsty, bound and helpless, waiting and not knowing what's going to happen to you. And all for a traffic ticket. Exhausted and humiliated, Martin arrived at Reidsville, where he was thrown into a narrow cell and made to don a prison uniform. Notes from other prisoners telling him how much they respected him took some of the edge off his confinement and the brutality he was suffering at the hands of the prison guards. In a letter to me about his ordeal, Martin wrote, "I know this whole experience is very difficult for you to adjust to, especially in your condition of pregnancy. But as I said to you yesterday, this is the cross that we must bear for the freedom of our people. So I urge you to be strong in the faith, and that in turn will strengthen me. I have the faith to believe that this excessive suffering that is now coming to our family will in some little way make Atlanta a better city, Georgia a better state, and America a better country. Just how, I do not yet know, but I have faith to believe it will happen. If I am correct, then our suffering will not be in vain." Meanwhile, Daddy King sought legal help. He planned to retain attorney Morris Abram, a well-respected civil rights lawyer, to help Martin get out of jail. But to our delight, the decision was taken out of our hands by a phone call. On the other end of the telephone was Sergeant Shriver, the brother-in-law of Senator John F. Kennedy, who was in the final week of his presidential campaign. "May I speak to Mrs. King?" Sergeant Shriver said. "Please hold for Senator Kennedy." After a brief greeting, Senator Kennedy expressed his concern for me and Martin. "I know this must be very hard for you. I understand you are expecting your third child, and I just wanted you to know that I was thinking about you and Dr. King. If there is anything I can do to help, please let me know." Of course, I told him that I appreciated his concern and would welcome any assistance. After the call, things happened fast. I began to hear encouraging news about Martin's release. Even A.D. said, "I'll bet you he'll be out by tomorrow night." A.D. was right. Senator Kennedy's brother Robert, a.k.a. Bobby, who was also his campaign manager, called Judge Mitchell to learn why Dr. King couldn't be released on bail pending appeal. That story leaked to the press, and evidently Judge Mitchell had a change of heart. He allowed Martin to be released on bail. I received the news about Martin's release around noon the next day and was, of course, overjoyed. Minister Wyatt T. Walker chartered a plane to bring me, Yoki, Marty, Mama, Daddy King, Christine, and her husband Isaac to meet Martin. That night, a mass meeting was held at Ebenezer. A standing-room-only crowd heard Daddy King, a former Nixon man, make the famous statement, "I had expected to vote against Senator Kennedy because of his religion. But now he can be my president, Catholic or whoever he is. He has the moral courage to stand up for what he knows is right. I've got all my votes and I've got a suitcase and I'm going to take them up there and dump them in his lap." The crowd roared its approval when Ralph Abernathy told them it was time to take off their Nixon buttons. The case was clear. Kennedy had responded to King. Nixon had not. A few days later, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was elected president by about 100,000 votes. This was a significant election in the shift of black Americans from voting Republican to voting Democrat. Many historians say, and I agree, that black voters, grateful for Kennedy's intervention on behalf of my husband, made the difference in the 1960 presidential election. Ironically, my husband was not allowed to vote because Georgia officials ruled that he hadn't lived in Atlanta long enough to establish residency, and he had waited too late to obtain an absentee ballot from Montgomery. Nevertheless, in prison stripes from a backwater jail, Martin, with his non-violent spirit and his defiant yielding to suffering, helped launch, at least for a time, a new covenant of grace into the political world.
Context of White Supremacy. End of the first audio segment. I'm not really sure what a new covenant of grace is. I would need clarification on that, but maybe we'll pick that up during the book review. Context of White Supremacy. Book study, My Life, My Legacy, My Love, the autobiography of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. If you would like to dial in, share your thoughts, observations, the number is 641-715-3640. The code 564943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. That number again, 641-715-3640. The code 564943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. If you want to chime in but you do not want to use your phone, you can use the free HD line, the free VOPE line. It's linked at Black Talk Radio Network. If you need the address, it is tiny, tiny.cc/1 race, and that is the number 1. Address again, tiny, tiny.cc/1 race, and that is the number 1. When you enter that address, you will click the link on the left of the page. It says free VOPE line. Click that link. It will open a small window on your screen. On the top line, it's a drop-down menu. Select the number that I just gave out, which again is 641-715-3640. Next line, it will ask for the code. That code again is 564943. Final line, it will ask for a name. You can click random keys. You can put in a real name, nickname, whatever you're comfortable with. Once you get all that information entered, click the green button at the bottom. It will connect you to the live program. It is the same procedure. If you would like to participate live, you'll see the dial pad on your screen. Press star 61. I'll see your hand on the screen. We'll get you on the line. You can share your thoughts. Folks who have commentary, still enjoying the book. If you have thoughts, reflections, analysis, people who dialed in who have a hand up, line should be open. Feel free to share your thoughts.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, Gus, and greetings to all the callers and listeners. Still pretty interesting book. Mrs. King, it's interesting how she basically saw something bigger than her when it comes to being being an anti-racist, fighting white supremacy. Because she always worried about her motherhood and other stuff that she could be doing in life, but she was just drawn to the movement in a way where she saw this life being bigger than her, and she kept referencing, her being a concert performer for a while, but she knew that something more important than that, than singing, was in the cards for her, which many other people in life could see the same thing, but I'm glad she made she gave some clarity on that word passive, because it's a thing that I kind of cringe when they say, passive, and she made it, she clarified saying that they were not a passive organization. They were more militant than anything. They were just not, just doing nonviolent tactics. So I'm glad she clarified that. The King-Nixon meeting, King at first supporting Richard Nixon. It's interesting. Many non-white people who call themselves Black Republicans often, use this thing of, well, King supported Nixon, so he's a Republican. Well, I tend to differ. Dr. King, to me, wasn't partisan in any politics. He just anybody who supported the movement, was somebody that he would support. But many, like I said, people who call themselves Black Republicans would, claim him for some reason or another. And also, too, the woman who stabbed Dr. King, as Mrs. King had reported, I give them much Black self-respect in that incident. They did say she had a mental problem. In most cases, people would, call her a coon or whatever, but, like I said, much Black self-respect to them. Dr. King basically said she just needed help and, didn't press charges or anything like that. So, that, like I said, that's the meaning of Black self-respect, and it's probably the reason why she was, demented, was probably due to the, racist society she was living in. White supremacy can, make us crazy at any moment. So that's something that, probably needs to be looked at as well. And I'm glad Dr. King and Mrs. King saw the insight in that. So that is all the notes I have for right now. I'll mute my line.
Appreciate that. Other folks who have a hand up that we have not heard from, if you have commentary, feel free.
Yes, may I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, greetings, Gus. Greetings to the other callers. Like the first caller, I think I have to start off giving credit to Mrs. King for understanding the priorities. She had desires, in her own career, but she realized that the biggest problem affecting the planet at that time and hundreds of years before and even now is racism, white supremacy, and she dedicated, herself, denying her desires to be a opera singer, to supporting her husband. So she deserved recognition, And she said that the anxiety that she felt was like rocks, in her stomach, not knowing, when her husband could be killed. And that incident where he was stabbed, and when they came to notify her, she thought that he was already dead. I mean, to live with that every day of your life, I mean, it's got to, let you feel a little bit of what it would be like at that time, the terrorism that they felt. But even with all of that, she always goes back to mentioning well-meaning white people like the Reverend, I guess his name was Walter or Arthur Walter, whatever, probably had very little, impact on the movement itself. Then Bella Abston, the Jewish lawyer, the later congresswoman, the CIA had kept a dossier on her, and anything that she may have done to help the cause was probably minimum. But to mention Ella Baker, who was a fearless civil rights organizer, one of the founding members of both the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She, was mentioned. I thought it was interesting that Bull Connors, at the time, notorious white racist that was, basically illiterate white terrorist, didn't finish high school. He was a Democrat at that time, and then Daddy King was a Republican, going to back Nixon. That seems almost laughable at this point, but it just shows the confusion that these political identifications go, because neither one of those, the Democrats or the Republicans at that time, had any of the black people in America's best interests at heart. It's good she mentioned the Ugandan independence, from British Empire. I think that had a dramatic effect upon how she looked at life globally, and seeing black people in charge for the first time. It had to be a rude awakening. A welcome awakening. And I mentioned A. Philip Randolph and Reverend Shuttlesworth, noteworthy civil rights warriors. And one last thing is the repeated unwarranted arrests that Martin Luther King was subjected to. White racists taking Dr. King on long rides into the woods late at night, those tactics and strategies, to scare him and inflict fear upon him is one of their valuable tactics. I think the blacks at that time wanted to show their support. A lot of them went to jail with him. It's not that. I think that she said that jail was a positive, thing for change, but it should not even be necessary to go to jail. All that has to be done is white people need to stop practicing racism. Just stop practicing racism, we can solve the problem of racism, white supremacy, the biggest problem on the planet. I'll mute my line. Gus, thanks for taking the call.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, everyone. Just briefly, I took 4 notes because I was on the road for the most part listening to the very interesting book, once again, on Mrs. King. Just start off by saying on how coy white people are and how much they really study us on a daily basis, but yet when they're in our presence, you wouldn't be able to know that based on how they behave. But even back during that time, they did a great deal of studying. There was no surprise on John Fitzgerald Kennedy and his phone call to Mrs. King in a most desperate of times. They already had done their studying. That's why he was able to be able to share such very personal background about how's your child, how's your children doing, and everything, because of their ability to really study and train us, and therefore Dr. King was recruited by these racist white supremacists because he was at that point in time the least of a situation to whereas the least of being able to really stand up and work against the system of racist white supremacy. It was beneficial for them, although he was a very, very courageous person. What him and his wife were doing, both of them also. pointing to England, back with the talk about England and how they basically was lowering their flags. From a historical standpoint, from what I understand, England as well as France, after the mid-1940s, was going bankrupt, basically. They had went all around the world and all of the territories, primarily of non-white people, that they had total control over. They had to basically loosen it up and share it more with the other members of the crime family of racism, white supremacy. With England, they said their empire was so vast that the sun never set on it. But after World War II, they basically struggled financially and had to basically lose financial grip on some of these places and share it with their other criminals around the world. I can recall hearing about not too far from where I'm staying right now, the Bahamas, as well as Jamaica, as far as they're concerned. And that basically took place all over the world, including with France, with Vietnam, quote unquote Indochina, as they called it, and so on and so forth. That needs to be illustrated to have an understanding that it wasn't just doing it from the standpoint of, oh, we feel so sorry what we did wrong to those Negroes. It basically was a move that they had to make based on their crime family of white supremacy. The whole idea with Nixon and the Kennedys, that sort of thing, it's very prudent in a sinister way to cultivate the interests of black people, and all you have to do is pick out a black person and illustrate that black person and build them up and show that you're being very, very, very nice to that person. And in that light, Dr. King and his family was picked in that way. SCLC forming in 1957. From my studies, I could be wrong, but from my studies, the large black, quote-unquote, Christian organization did not like what Dr. King and several others were doing as being, quote-unquote, too militant. So they didn't get their support, so therefore they formed their own organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957. Just wanted to speak on briefly Fred Shuttlesworth. Fred Shuttlesworth was a crazy, courageous person, very courageous person. I did some studying on him and what he was doing. He wasn't so much as prevalent as Dr. King, but him and I believe his brother was like really very courageous people, right in the face of white supremacy, and all of the bombings of the home and all of that. He was also involved in that too. I heard his name, that's why I mentioned him. Just last but not least, again, just want to emphasize on how coy and very sinister the Kennedy family was, and how they was able to contact Mrs. King in that famous phone call, and basically from the standpoint with the father making that famous quote-unquote statement about turning over all of these votes to these white people, and our behavior has not changed in that light, so to speak, so much from what I've heard, even in today's time in our relationship to white people. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I know. If we have other folks who have commentary they would like to share, feel free, press *61 if you're on the line and you have commentary you want to share on the text. Some of the things that stood out that I took note of, let's see. White people are very strategic, very methodical, and I think we talk frequently about whites having 500-year plan, 1,000-year plan, with the way that they use what's called the press, newspapers, television, all different types of media, even just what people are talking about. They are phenomenal at it, and just getting Dr. King on Time magazine, that's not an accident. Like, very powerful white people sit down and decide Sometimes it can be weeks in advance, months in advance, could be longer than that. Who's going to be on the cover of this magazine that we know millions of people will be sure that millions of people will see this and will say that, oh, yes, this is the de facto president of the Negras for 1963. White people can do that sort of thing. They can build you up. They can tear you down. They can put a lot of attention on you. They can take it away. They can make it so that nobody is talking about you or knows your name. And this, when she continues, she says, Martin's recognition in the mainstream media had resulted in him being celebrated as the ex officio president of Black America. In my view, this sort of thing, when white people, when they put you out there, they can put you on television or, say, hey, you got the best-selling book, it can make it seem as though you have more power than you actually do in the system of white supremacy. And a lot of times this is just setting you up to be the person, the black person that gets blamed and fussed at when things go wrong, which they invariably will in the system of white supremacy. Let's see. Metaphor, it's not that Gus T does not quote-unquote like metaphors. It's that I think it is important to pay attention to when they are used, particularly in context of racism. The metaphor that Mrs. King used, she says, when she had felt like rocks piling up in her stomach around all of the active things that were happening, their house being bombed and her husband being arrested and, what's going to happen, danger every day, the killings in the middle of Emmett Till's body being found, just the stress, black mental health. And again, this is a whole life of trauma. That's all we've heard thus far in the 2.5 weeks that we've been reading this book. And she says, she goes on, I compare that with her whole life of trauma, right? Everything that happened, her house being burned down when she's 15. They burned down her father's sawmill. They bomb her house with her. She's only been married a short period of time with her newborn daughter. All of these things had threatening. She and her husband, they have to take the phone off the hook to be able to get rest. All of these things happening to them throughout her life. And then, later on, you compare that to this white fella that she mentions, Robert Gretz. I don't know how you spell Graetz, who's a reverend. This is a white pastor who came in to assist during the Montgomery Bus Boycott. I'm reading, this is an article. I'd never heard of this guy. It's from the Montgomery Advertiser, where it says when Rosa Parks, Fred Gray, activist Edie Nixon, and Dr. King formed the Montgomery Improvement Association after Rosa Parks' arrest, the boycott began. Reverend Gretz was added to the board, eventually serving as MIA secretary. He and Jeannie, his wife, began taking part in shuttling boycotters around the city and helping the MIA with planning and organizing. Because they were white, their participation in the boycott drew immediate attention and violence. In addition to the bombings, Jeannie said there were constant threats, rocks thrown at their home, and someone tampered with their car, pouring sugar in the gas tank and slashing their tires. It was a very disconcerting time, Jeannie said. We never doubted what we were doing, not once, and we mostly didn't worry about ourselves, but the children were a different matter. On the night of the bombing in 1957, the Gretz's family included 3 small children, 2 of whom were under the age of 1. Throughout their 3-year stay, their children were the target of constant threats. I'm not going to read the whole report, but they do go on a little bit later in the article. They talk, because they're still alive, right? To my knowledge, I think they're still alive when I checked online. But they go on to say it's not just black and white. They say it's not just about black and white. There are many people who are oppressed in this world: women, the poor, handicapped, individuals, gays. That's what we learned. Don't just think it's racism, white supremacy. That, in my view, anytime a white person says that, that right there is a deliberate act of racism, white supremacy. And I take that, I've heard this before from whites who, for a period of time, experienced struggle and turmoil for helping Negras or doing something that was against the wishes of what other powerful racists wanted done. Even that, in my opinion, does not, and just following logic, does not take you off the racist suspect list. It's been my experience that a lot of times any white person doing anything for us, just it becomes way, way, way overappreciated, and just this gratitude, like this is just the greatest white person, not thinking of them as racist, and just not keeping in mind whatever these folks did. Okay, so they got some rides for some black people during the 1950s. Okay, even if they died, even if their whole family had died, like in terms of what needs to be done for this problem, whatever. I mean, hey, tons of black people have died. They died, their wife died, their children died. You're going to have to come up with a lot more than just these white people had a tough time for, a few days. Their children had a tough time for a few days. Continuing. Let's see. I thought it was really important, the international aspect. Racism, white supremacy is a global problem. Where she says, I felt after seeing a new movement being birthed in the South, now we could witness the winds of change stirring in Africa too. The two struggles against colonialism in Africa and racial oppression in America were tributaries of the same river. Metaphor. And I point that out, not that it is a problem, but I think sometimes it is important more than the flowery language. I think being accurate that what we mean when we say tributaries of the same river is that you have a global system of white supremacy where everyone on this planet who is classified as white is working together to dominate everyone that they say is not white. It might look a little different in different parts of the world, but essentially that is what is happening in all areas of people activity. I think that level of explicitness is frequently lacking, and it causes problems. We don't want to rely on a lot of metaphors to articulate this. I thought it was interesting, particularly, I think, at this period of time, right? I think it's very different, right? Her talking about being on the continent and seeing these quote-unquote nations escaping colonialism, so-called, and it looking like the whites were leaving and black people were going to be taking charge and in power. And she says that it was so exhilarating to see black people in charge for the first time. I was in a situation in which black people were the majority in a land they could call their own. What an impact. It gave me such a great sense of pride. It reminded me of that phrase dignity, which I said is in the book more than the term racism last week. It also, I think, the same type of sentiment when people were so excited, the emotion, the symbolism of seeing President Obama many years later, or Nelson Mandela in South Africa, where fundamentally white power still rules. Obvious, but it can look like you have some black people in charge. White people are very adept at running that game, and for a lot of non-white people, the emotion of it can overwhelm us just being logical and looking at things even when they are bleak. Continuing, I felt the same notion where Reverend Greats and I guess this white guy and his wife that helped out during the movement, racist suspects, them both, this same sort of sentiment for good white folks. Abraham Lincoln, it reminded me of John Brown. I was expecting him to be mentioned as well as one of the good whites, along with some of the whites that she mentioned from Antioch College. She says, when she says, I saw how some Indian women held much higher positions than women back home, she must be talking about white women. She continues, there were women in Parliament, and in 1959 a woman was even a justice in India's high courts. Imagine that. I know that someday women in the United States will lead the country not only in one of the highest courts of the land, but also at the top as president. I'm curious if she's thinking a white woman or a black female. Very curious. Even when she says, if I could live to see that come to pass, was she thinking black female, white woman, same thing? I could not imagine her thinking those are one and the same. And I generally push back anytime I hear anyone speaking as though these are one and the same. They most certainly are not, in my opinion. White women are not treated like black females, not now, 2017, not 100 years ago, and most likely not as long as white supremacy exists. Let's see. We want to make sure we get it. This notion of reconciliation, where she talks about them accepting Gandhi's policy of love and nonviolence, that the end goal is reconciliation. And I just, that's one of my cringe terms, particularly in context of white supremacy. You would have to stop the practice of racism, which I've never seen done. That we cannot have reconciliation before that has been totally eradicated. Then there would have to be repair. Like, there are just a lot of steps before that, could even happen. And that is not my goal at all. The production of justice does not mean that we have to, quote unquote, reconcile with racists. Not in my view at all. It just struck me as bizarre when she said the Indians had a great love of Negro spirituals, particularly when she includes all that about the untouchables, and these are darker people, as I have been told, and the same problem, colorism that they have there. And particularly even last week, the report about the abuse and terrorism that many Africans face visiting the country known as India. Them having a great love of Negro spirituals struck me. I've heard a lot of racists. We've had Klan members on the program who said that they liked watching Negro sitcoms. So, yeah. I'll leave it there. I really appreciated her persistence with saying that she wanted a house that made logical sense considering the danger that they were in, to have, some semblance of stability. Evil lurked around the corner. I replaced the term evil with white. Whites lurked around the corner, which would have been literally and figuratively true. The whole manipulative way with white supremacy in law that she deals with in chapter 8, where her husband, Dr. King, he goes to court and they don't tell him that he's on probation. Like, I feel like these are the same types of tactics that are used right now, April 2017, in terms of white people conceal. We talk about this on the program regularly. How do white people conceal willfully constructive information? That's one of the main ways that they practice racism, white supremacy, and just living with this, both of them, just hearing the detail, her as an attempted husband. I think it might be another great illustration of why Mr. Fuller says that at best we are attempted husbands, attempted wives under the system of white supremacy, that you can't function as a husband, wife, mother, father when racists can come and snatch you at any time. And as she said, you're helpless. Nothing I can do about it. My husband has been snatched. Your father has been snatched, and, unless we know a powerful white man that we can get on the phone to intervene, we are at their mercy. You do not qualify as a husband, wife, father, mother, if those are the circumstances that fit your existence. And that, is true for Gus T Renegade, unfortunately. Where they shove Dr. King in the back with a German Shepherd, again, reminds me to, pause when we get excited about, getting upset with another non-white person, another victim of racism, or we don't agree with their view on racism and we want to talk bad about them or name call. Just reminds me that, even the victims of white supremacy that we might disagree with have probably had to endure some pretty substantial terrorism and even some substantial abuse because of views, counter-racist work that they did, even if we didn't agree with it. Let's see. All of this for a traffic ticket reminded me of Sandra Bland. A lot of different black people, this continuing problem. All of this for a traffic ticket. I think I can stop there. It sounded like the same kind of looking for a good white person. I certainly can grasp when a white person is able to get someone that you care about out of greater confinement. I can understand the emotion of that, but I just think the logic, I think Firefighter spoke to that eloquently, and I think just the methodical nature with which racists, hey, we can get this one nigger out of jail and probably get a whole lot of these niggas to vote for us. And these same, in fact, the Kennedy administration, they approved some of the very COINTELPRO operations that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI carried out against the King family once the Kennedys were in the White House. Bobby Kennedy at the Department of Justice as Attorney General. So, yeah, I can leave that there. Anybody have additional comments that they wanted to get in before we get to the second audio segment? We have about 20 minutes, maybe a little less if you have additional commentary. Other folks, comments they would like to share, line should be open. Oh, wait a minute. We have Thomas in New York. Did you have commentary, sir?
Good evening. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Good evening, Gus. Good evening to all the callers. You made some great points. That was crazy. You put them in the back seat with the German Shepherd for like a 3-hour ride over a parking ticket. The terrorism, her life is I mean, she's probably been one of the most terrorized women in modern history, from her youth all the way up to her adulthood, to her losing her husband. Just terrible. You know, I had some notes because I haven't been able to participate the last couple of weeks. Last week I spoke about white people peeing on other people. And I think that, you know, I remembered the Mandela and the Richard Williams. I was glad you brought up the Chris Kyle because I didn't even put that correlation together. Being that it wasn't white people peeing on black people in his instance, but definitely just showing a constant trend of them peeing on people. And I wonder if in that Navy SEAL training, if a black guy was peeing, I wonder if the white guys would crowd around him. But it also brought to life the peeing. The Khalif Browder, when in the documentary, when the police the correctional officers would walk through the mental part of the hospital of the prison, all of the prisoners had all these exotic ways to spit piss at the officers as they walked past. So it just shows that it may be a form that all these people have a mental illness or so on. I think that also from listening to the reading that she and her husband, but for most part, she's definitely a victim of white validation disease, and I think that it comes from her relationship with the white man, which seems to be a trend. Area 8 activity definitely plays a huge way of how black people see the system and how they're willing to accept the fact that all white people can potentially be very dangerous. They always have that good white person or looking for that good white person if they've been in a sexual relationship with them. Also, once again, I'm glad that she's calling it from the first, parts of the readings. She's calling it terrorism. I think that's very accurate. These are all acts of terrorism. I wish she would put racist terrorism in front of it. And I was glad that you also pointed out that the book had her mentioning racism less than she mentioned, I forget what it was, but it just, and from reading her life story, that should be impossible. This is all racism. Also from the reading this week, when she described India, first it was how they sat there and they took and endured the British non-violently, and then, when they get to India, people are living in the streets. That was the cost they paid, the price they paid, all the homelessness, people carrying all their things, just trying to squat somewhere and living that way with no crime, but still dirt poor, and it still is to the day. I have more from the book, but I know that I'm infringing on other time. I just, this would take a long time to read. And I have to start to prepare to get ready to get to the plantation. So thank you for the show, Gus, and thanks for taking my call.
For sure. We have other folks who have commentary they would like to share. Feel free.
I have another question, if I can.
Yes, sir.
I am, for some reason, real curious because we're talking about the night primarily right now. We're still in the 1950s. Before Dr. King was awarded that global award. I forgot what it was actually called when he got the award, because it was a cash prize that came along with it. But I'm trying to figure out. It cost a lot of money to travel to those places that she was saying that they was traveling to. Now I was aware of it, but it comes to my mind. Well, how did they get the finances to do that type of international traveling? That's just a curiosity of mine, because I mean, going to India and some of the other places within India, as well as other places around the world during that time in the 50s, wasn't a whole lot of black people that I know of that could afford that. And primarily, the only thing I knew he was doing was a minister at the time. Maybe they was collecting monies for him to go abroad and whatnot. I'm just curious, on it. Just a thought. Anybody got any ideas? Let me know.
That's a good question. I mean, in this era, certainly you don't have just black people flying around the world willy-nilly in this area. It's not like you got tons of black people who own their own yachts and private jets and that sort of thing at this time.
Right.
And I mean, even still, even if you did, white people are still in charge, so they can meet you at customs and say, no niggers here, which did happen to Malcolm X. He talks about that happened to him in the 60s, where he was denied entry into France. And that happens to black people now. So, that is a good question. How did they get the finances and the ability, the permission, really, to go globetrotting to all these places?
And this was before the Nobel Peace Prize. Along with the Nobel Peace Prize, he was also awarded some money. Now, reportedly, he gave that money away, according to what I've always heard. But that wasn't even until something like the 1963 or 64, something like that. Right. And we haven't even gotten up to that point yet.
Correct.
Because that book that he wrote, it had a lot of that. What she's talking about now, the book that he wrote had a lot of that in it, about the background of how he studied from Mahatma Gandhi and what he was doing, and also he traveled over there. And just thoughts, it's similar to what my thoughts is with Minister Malcolm. But I did hear that his oldest sister, which she was doing some things in Boston that may not always have been legal, helped finance him in some of the trips that he made. But I have never heard anything in regards to Dr. King and how he was able to get around to all those places in the 50s.
Hey, I have a theory on that. I thought that was a great point, because it does sound very suspicious. But he is the son of a preacher, and we know that preachers make a good amount of money. I mean, at least around here they do. All the ones I've ever seen, they drive a nice car, they live in a nice house. I mean, so he is the preacher's son, and his father was a very prominent preacher in a very prominent black city. I'm sure that they had plenty of money.
That's true. He was one of the prominent ministers in the city of Atlanta. His Daddy King was. But normally in that situation, even back with I believe it was called Divine, the minister in New York, they didn't have so much of interest that went beyond basically building themselves up. As far as that's concerned, as far as how sincere Dr. King was, that's another ingredient in this process that I'm thinking about. Well, where did he get the money from? Because I always respected him being a very sincere person. Just a thought. Just a thought.
Other thoughts from any of the folks with us before we get to the second audio segment?
Can I bear it?
Yes, sir.
I guess I'm assuming that on retired firefighter's point, I'm assuming that his first trip to Ghana, maybe Kwame Nkrumah paid for the travel expenses because they were invited. So that's what I'm basically.
That's true. That's true.
That was that one. So.
Yeah, that's true. That is true because he did finance. And that's one of the, like I said, back with England, the England thing, and all of that was part of the ploy that white people are backing off on the system of racism, realizing the evil that they've done. No, England was going bankrupt along with France after World War II, and they basically had to have more of a sharing effect with the other, and as I mentioned, the other criminals who are white people in the world, powerful white people, and that basically what took place with England and France and Germany and all of that mess that went on back in the 1940s.
Other commentary, folks want to make sure they get in. I thought it was great, Barbara Reynolds, from the introduction at the beginning of the program, when she talked about not understanding racism, and she almost said it that way specifically, not understanding racism when she started as a journalist covering the civil rights movement and meeting these people, Mrs. King and what have you. And the violence of going down and covering this and participating in all of this and realizing, like, wow, this is what racism means. Like, I could be killed. A white person could come and kill me, like, in the next 5 minutes, and nothing might not be even done about it. That's what racism means, like coming to understand that, where she did not have an accurate understanding of racism before. I thought that was really important. And then her connecting that with more recent events, the assassination of Fred Hampton in 1969, and Amadou Diallo and Rodney King, just really I thought was important context for the person who helped put this project together. Folks satisfied? Any other comments they want to get in? Are we good for the first audio segment? I will assume folks are satisfied for the time being. If you have comments that you did not get in, you should make a note, because we should have ample time once the second audio segment concludes. If you missed out anything or just want to make sure that you share. With that, we will go ahead and get started. We are picking up, make sure I didn't lose my place in the text. We're right at the beginning. We're at chapter 9. I've been called by God to. Chapter 9. I've been called by God to. Context of White Supremacy. This is the autobiography of Mrs. Coretta Scott King. My life, my love, my legacy. Audio segment number 2.
9. I've been called by God too. If the child I was carrying had been born a girl, her name would have been Mahalia. Martin made that promise to Mahalia Jackson after the great gospel diva cooked him a sumptuous chicken dinner smothered in brown mushroom gravy. After such a feast, he was helpless to do anything but promise to honor her request to make her our third child's namesake. But it was a baby boy who arrived on January 30th, 1961, and we named him Dexter, after the first church Martin pastored. Having another child, looking into the eyes of my innocent newborn, brought with it the familiar and agonizing questions. Would the change we all wanted and were willing to die for come soon enough so my children could grow up in a world that welcomed them as equals and beloved human beings? I was birthing children that my Bible told me were made in the image of God. Would they be treated as such? Our movement was caught up in a whirlwind of change whipping across America. I wish I could say that we knew what the consequences of our actions would be. But all we knew for certain was that the winds of change were blowing, sometimes in our favor, and sometimes not. Throughout 1960, the year before Dexter was born, the student movement, which staged sit-ins at lunch counters and department stores, had continued to shake the South. Martin and the students were very close. At the sit-ins, many of the young people carried signs reading, "Remember the teachings of Gandhi and Martin Luther King." That April, as the protests spread, Martin and the SCLC leadership sent Ella Baker to set up a meeting with the students, to help organize them and set up a presentation on nonviolence. Martin and the SCLC appropriated money to finance the meeting. Martin and James Lawson, then a graduate student in theology, were the keynote speakers. At that meeting, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was formed. Under Martin's guidance, the members pledged themselves to nonviolence. Later, in December 1960, a U.S. Supreme Court decision extended the prohibition of segregation to all interstate trains and buses and all train stations and bus terminals. Those of us who lived in the South knew that there was no meat on the bone of that new law. Despite the court rulings, when I traveled from my home in Atlanta to different parts of the South, signs designating colored and white were still attached to waiting rooms, restrooms, water fountains, and lunch counters. On trains, blacks were still seated at separate tables and hidden behind a curtain in the dining cars. The symbols as well as the practice of segregation remained. Seeing those signs was humiliating. I dreaded going any long distance except by automobile. Then, in March 1961, protests to test the law began. The Freedom Rides. These protests were primarily a project of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, which had the backing of the SCLC and SNCC. Martin served as chairman of the Freedom Ride Coordinating Committee, through which CORE, the SCLC, and SNCC strategized a way to keep the rides happening until victory was achieved. Nothing had changed, but now, with federal law behind us, with students sitting down at lunch counters and with whites and blacks alike boarding Greyhound buses, the numbness and the acceptance of segregation were wearing off. We had hope. While the sit-ins and protests were taking new forms, my life also was taking a new shape, much like the patterns my mother used to sew in her quilts. While I was happy to be Martin's wife and the mother of his children, I was more than a wife while he lived, and more than a widow after he died. On the one hand, I was a co-partner with him, married not only to him but to the movement. Yet there was also a corner of life that belonged exclusively to me. More and more I served as public speaker when Martin asked me to stand in for him at certain functions. I continued to perform, giving concerts to raise money for the movement, and I continued my role as a spokeswoman for the peace movement that I had begun through the Quaker groups at Antioch. Granted, Martin was always ambivalent about my role out front, which sent me traveling across the country instead of staying at home. I suppose I experienced the personal dilemma that baffles every working woman. What happens when you are expected to be Superwoman, to perform a dozen conflicting tasks at the same time? I was trying to balance my concert career with motherhood and my responsibilities as Martin's wife and chief confidant. Most of the time, Martin was very supportive of my work. Once, however, I did have to set the record straight. During one exchange, he told me, "You see, I am called by God, and you aren't." I responded, "I have always felt that I have a call on my life, too. I've been called by God, too, to do something. You may not understand it, but I have a sense of a calling, too." Still not convinced, Martin turned to me and said, "Well, somebody has to take care of the kids." "No problem," I said. "I will do that." Looking a bit crushed, he asked, "You aren't totally happy being my wife and the mother of my children, are you?" "I love being your wife and the mother of your children," I said. "But if that's all I am to do, I'll go crazy." Despite his ambivalence, when it was especially important for me to be with him or to advance issues for which I had a special passion, Martin was really encouraging. One such event came in March 1962, when I was invited by the Women's Strike for Peace to go as a delegate to Switzerland to support international efforts to ban atomic testing. When I brought the invitation to Martin, he said, "This is important. You need to do that." With his blessing, I was able to turn my attention to global issues of diplomacy and international peace. Women's Strike for Peace was founded in 1961 by Bella Abzug and Dagmar Wilson, and was initially part of the movement to ban nuclear testing and end the Vietnam War. On November 1, 1961, the organization mobilized about 50,000 women to march and demonstrate against nuclear weapons in 60 U.S. cities. It was the largest national women's peace protest of the 20th century. In Washington, D.C., about 1,500 women, led by Dagmar Wilson, gathered at the foot of the Washington Monument. President John F. Kennedy watched from a window in the White House. On April 6, 1962, the U.S. Women for Peace delegation departed for Switzerland. In Geneva, we were joined by women from Scandinavia and other countries such as Australia and the Soviet Union. Our goal was to join the international effort to influence the atomic test ban talks being held there by the United Nations Committee on Disarmament. We were there for the sake of our children. We knew that radioactive fallout from atmospheric tests was affecting our children's milk, bone structure, and overall health. Less than 2 years after our visit, we felt that our efforts, along with those of other peace advocates, had helped make history when the United States and the Soviet Union signed a nuclear test ban treaty. I returned home to Atlanta from Geneva on a Friday. To my sorrow, I did not have time to properly rehearse for a concert I was scheduled to perform in Cincinnati, Ohio on Sunday. I performed the concert, a standard repertoire with French, Italian, and German songs, but I wasn't happy with it. I thought, I have 3 kids. I have to figure out how to do this in a way that isn't so stressful. And so, I developed the idea of the Freedom Concert. I patterned it after Paul Robeson's performances, which I'd had the good fortune of first seeing at Antioch. He would give a political commentary before he sang. Similarly, I would open my concerts by talking about the struggle, the movement. I would narrate and sing, alternating parts of the story with a song, mostly hymns or freedom songs. The Freedom Concerts, though less taxing on my voice than the standard classical music repertoire I had been performing, were highly rewarding. They raised thousands of dollars for the SCLC, which badly needed funds. So Cincinnati became my last concert with a standard repertoire. Afterward, I took a 2-year hiatus and did not sing again publicly until I performed my first Freedom Concert on November 15, 1964, at New York City's Town Hall. As I stepped away from the concert stage during that hiatus, I stepped back into the pace of the movement, which was racing along at a dazzling, tumultuous speed, with both victories and perils around every corner. And when Martin was facing danger, I was facing danger too, whether I was out on the street with him or awaiting his return to our home. The term other half aptly fit Martin and me. In fact, we were more than that. I often felt as if we were one heartbeat, one soul. When he was in jail, I was in jail. When he was beaten up, I was beaten up. In some instances, his whole family was in pain due to the emotions my children internalized through me when Martin was endangered. I often said I was stronger in a crisis, but that describes only my response, not my inner feelings. When he was away, I had to wait with my own anxieties and with the eager eyes of our 4 children, only 2 of whom could actually speak well enough to ask, "When is Daddy coming home?" On one night back in May 1961, Martin barely escaped grave injury from a mob gathered outside a rally for the Freedom Riders at Ralph Abernathy's First Baptist Church in Montgomery. After Martin's speech, carloads of angry whites surrounded the church, throwing rocks through the stained glass windows, showering the worshippers with shards of glass. The men outside cursed and threatened to burn down the church. With rocks and curses filling the air, Martin and the congregation prayed and sang hymns, including "We Shall Overcome." As Martin left, a gas bomb whizzed past his head. One of his aides, Reverend Fred C. Bennett, picked up the bomb and threw it over Martin's shoulder, away from him, and someone pulled Martin back into the church, where he stayed most of the night with the worshippers. Eventually, someone reached the U.S. Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, who sent federal marshals to disperse the mob. As was our routine when Martin came home, our family filled the house with prayer and songs of praise. The climate we faced on a daily basis gave us much to pray about. In the fall of 1961, some SNCC and NAACP leaders turned their focus to Albany, Georgia, a town of about 50,000 residents, 40% black, about 180 miles south of our home in Atlanta. Albany was the heart of hardcore redneck country. Early that November, SNCC-trained high school students began a peaceful protest at an illegally segregated bus terminal in Albany, and although none of the students was arrested, their actions inspired a movement to desegregate all of Albany. A series of sit-ins, boycotts, and other forms of nonviolent protest started up, so that by December, more than 500 people had been jailed in Albany. Then Dr. William G. Anderson, a respected black osteopath and a friend of Martin's from their days as college students in Atlanta, called Martin for help. On December 15th, Martin spoke at Shiloh Baptist Church in Albany. The next day, he and Ralph joined a protest there and were arrested. Martin's arrival had attracted even more people to protest. In fact, I had never seen anything like Albany. Black maids were going to jail under assumed names to keep from being fired by their white employers. I saw children who had been arrested and released, enlisting to go back to jail again just to be with Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. While other people's children wanted to be jailed with a hero, my own children just wanted Daddy home. Since our family lived within a 5-hour drive of Albany, I often left baby Dexter with caregivers and drove with our 2 oldest children to see Martin. Yoki was 7 and Marty was 5 during Martin's confinement in Albany. To avoid explaining why we had to go in the back door of a restaurant to avoid being called nigger, I always packed our lunch. We also tried to avoid stopping at the segregated restrooms. Albany would be the first time the children saw their father in prison clothes in a small, dingy cell. I wondered how they would feel. They were confused when the cell door did not open and Daddy did not come out, but moments later they played happily up and down the darkened jail corridors. It was only as they grew older that the tougher questions came. In Albany, Martin reached an agreement with city officials. If they released him, he would leave town, which was something they badly wanted, as long as they also agreed to desegregate the buses and also release all the other protesters on bail. Martin left town. The city officials failed to keep their end of the bargain, and on July 10, 1962, Martin and Ralph returned to Albany to face trial. They were convicted of leading the big December march. I attended the trial and was surprised when Martin and Ralph were given suspended sentences. In fact, they were released from jail to stop the public attention that was being focused on segregation there. Rather than integrate public facilities, Albany officials closed the city parks and the public library. While we did not win a large victory at that time, our loss helped the SCLC learn valuable lessons. True, effective change was hampered by a lack of registered black voters. Around this time, I began to agonize over what would become of our movement if something happened to Martin. The movement had many bright, committed young people and great civil rights leaders, such as Whitney Young at the Urban League and Roy Wilkins at the NAACP. But the media had essentially anointed Martin President of Black America. I understood that leadership training was basic to the SCLC concept, but I did not know if it was possible for a charismatic leader to establish a permanent organization, since that type of leadership is built on the personality or appeal of that particular leader. For instance, the Marcus Garvey movement became a shell of itself when J. Edgar Hoover, the same man who tried to discredit my husband, succeeded in a campaign to imprison Garvey. Movements headed by other charismatic leaders, including Gandhi, collapsed without the leader or a structure to continue the leader's passion and programs. When the heads of General Motors or AT&T move on, the established structure and rules provide a foundation for continuity under the next leader. But in our movement, we were making up the rules as we went from city to city. All too often, the media and the powers that be wanted to deal only with Martin, reinforcing the notion that the movement had only one spokesman. In addition to putting a lot of pressure on Martin, this created tension among some of the other movement leaders. But Martin did not think of himself as the chief. He preferred and worked well with a coalition. It was a coalition that was growing by the day, as scores of young people joined the movement. The involvement of dozens of America's best and brightest who cast their lot with us, engaged their minds, and readied their bodies for a bloody battlefield helped reduce some of the angst I had about our future direction. Most were college students or recent graduates. Some, like Andrew Young, had already received movement-related battle scars. A graduate of Hartford Theological Seminary, Young was a pastor at Bethany Congregational Church in Thomasville, Georgia. He knew what it felt like to watch the KKK parade around town in full regalia as a warning against the voting rights drive he was leading there. While the SCLC was well connected through the network of Black Baptist and Methodist churches, Young's ability to plug us into white liberal circles was invaluable. He later moved up through the SCLC to become executive vice president, the rank he held at the time of Martin's death. He would become one of my closest friends, and after Martin's death, a surrogate father to our children. The Reverend James Bevel, along with his future wife, Diane Nash, came from the Nashville movement. James Orange, one of the finest organizers in the country, came from Birmingham. Willie Bolden, Lester Hankerson, and Ben Clark came to us from the Savannah movement, led by that staunch agitator Hosea Williams. Like Williams, Bernard Lafayette specialized in conducting training in nonviolence. Septima Clark brought to the SCLC's Citizenship Education Program valuable insight from her experiences teaching adult education in her native Charleston, South Carolina. The Reverend Walter Fauntleroy, whom I would later help get elected as the first non-voting delegate to Congress from the District of Columbia, also became a valuable aid, to the point at which Martin would say, "He is one of two persons who could run SCLC after I'm gone." Still, though the future was always in our minds, we didn't have much time for long-term planning or soul-searching or reflection, as there were too often more pressing matters to attend to. That was the case as the work of the civil rights movement moved on from Albany to one of the biggest and most demanding campaigns yet, Birmingham. 10. So evil only God could change it. Martin once said of Birmingham, "All the evils and injustices the Negro can be subjected to are right here in Birmingham." I soon found that truer words had never been spoken. Birmingham was notorious for ordinary day-to-day terrorism. The city had been hoisted to national infamy by black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, which called it the worst city in America. Between 1957 and 1963, 18 unsolved bombings of black churches and homes occurred, earning the city the ignoble title of Bombingham. Bull Connor, the city's infamous Commissioner of Public Safety, was notorious for his efforts to enforce segregation, deny black citizens their civil rights, and strong-arm any protests. I was told that when the NAACP tried to meet, he sent his police to bust up the meetings, and had thus succeeded in keeping that organization out of Birmingham. In 1962, Bull Connor closed 68 parks, 38 playgrounds, 6 swimming pools, and 4 golf courses, rather than comply with a federal court order to desegregate public facilities. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who convinced Martin to make Birmingham the next major campaign, barely escaped death when his home was bombed to ruins in 1956. When he tried to enroll his children at a public school in 1957, he was chain-whipped on a public street by a white mob, and his wife was stabbed, with the cops present. In none of these incidents were any arrests made. Birmingham was the largest city in a police state presided over by Governor George Wallace, whose inauguration vow was segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Once Martin and his SCLC team understood the viciousness of Birmingham, I knew what Martin's reaction would be. What better place to stage a nonviolent direct action than in one of the most violent enclaves in the nation? Before taking that action, however, in early 1963, Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth met with the Kennedy brothers to urge the federal government to initiate national civil rights legislation, but those efforts didn't work. Then, early in April, the Birmingham city government obtained a state circuit court injunction against protests, and Martin decided he would defy the injunction and go to jail. The timing of those protests, however, depended on the birth of our fourth child. I was 8 months pregnant, and Martin was determined either to slow things down or to speed things up so he could be with me and see his child being born before going to jail. During the month of March, Martin dashed back and forth between Birmingham and Atlanta, keeping a watch on me. My pregnancy was becoming difficult. I had extreme hip discomfort, as I'd had when I was pregnant with Marty, and could not walk down the stairs. My doctor confined me to bed rest, and Martin had to run up and down the stairs, preparing my meals and bringing me a bedpan. Unable to stand seeing me suffer, he tried to get our doctor to induce labor. Moreover, Good Friday was approaching. Because of its major symbolic and religious significance, Martin wanted the demonstrations to take place so he could be in jail on that date. He didn't want events to overtake him and snatch him away from me when he was really needed. A friend recommended that I take a dose of castor oil to induce labor, and Martin and I agreed. Nothing happened. The next day I took a larger dose, and on Thursday, March 28th, as soon as I reached the hospital and was settled, my beautiful little darling daughter was born. We named her Bernice Albertine after her 2 grandmothers, and called her Bunny. The very next day, however, Martin left for Birmingham. 5 days later, the protests began. Did I feel abandoned or neglected because of my husband's quick departure after the birth of our daughter? The question has been raised before, but my answer is not complicated. For the most part, Martin and I shared values. I knew he loved his family, but we both had a higher calling and purpose that was much larger than the fulfillment of our own desires. As much as I loved Martin, I knew he belonged not just to me, but to his calling. It had to be his first priority. On April 3rd, lunch counter sit-ins began in Birmingham. Arrests followed. Over 3 days, about 500 people had been jailed. There was a city injunction against protesting, but Martin took a leap of faith. He chose to break the injunction by organizing a march and provoking the police into arresting him on April 12th, Good Friday. He announced his decision at Zion Hill Church, where the march was scheduled to begin. In his address, he made the link between the redemptive act of the suffering of Jesus on Good Friday and what lay ahead for those who faced sudden arrests or beatings. As he left the pulpit, women and men shouted out to him, "There he goes, just like Jesus." Then people poured out into the aisle, following him to the march. It looked like every police officer on the force was waiting. All along the streets, blacks were encouraging themselves by singing freedom songs. When Martin passed, they applauded. As the march neared downtown, Bull Connor ordered his men to move in. 2 muscular policemen roughly clutched Martin and Ralph by the back of their shirts and shoved them into a police car. Martin and Ralph were separated and held in solitary confinement. Even their lawyers could not see them. And neither could I. Because of the complications from my pregnancy, I was confined to my house in Atlanta. I waited by the phone, but there was no call from Martin. Saturday came. Still no Martin. I woke up on Easter Sunday despondent. I knew how badly Martin had wanted to be in his pulpit. In desperation, I called Reverend Wyatt T. Walker in Birmingham. "What have you heard, Wyatt?" I asked. "Coretta, I haven't been able to get a phone message to him. Martin is being held incommunicado." Wyatt suggested I put in a call to President Kennedy. For a moment, I thought, me? Call the president? Kennedy had been helpful to us before. Still, it seemed a bold move to reach out. I mulled it over. I had heard Martin was sleeping on a steel cot with no mattress. I thought about the evil ways of Birmingham, how somebody could kill him. Resolved, I tried to get the number where the president was staying in West Palm Beach, but to no avail. I told the White House operator to find Vice President Lyndon Johnson, but that didn't work either. After explaining my situation, the operator, a kind and sympathetic woman, suggested I call Pierre Salinger, the White House press secretary. I reached Salinger immediately, and he promised to make every effort to have the president call me. While I was waiting for a call from the president, Harry Belafonte called. Harry and I had become close friends ever since performing at the same benefit concert in New York on the 1-year anniversary of the start of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. From then on, whenever tragedy or a crisis hit, which was often, he showed up ready to help. I could lean on Harry. That day I was very depressed and spilled out my troubles. I explained that I was not trying to get Martin out of jail because I knew he wouldn't want that. I was just concerned about his safety. I told Harry about the phone ringing off the hook with inquiries about Martin, the demands of a 2-week-old baby, and my desire to go immediately to Birmingham to be with Martin. Harry took charge, telling me that if Martin wouldn't object, I should hire a nurse and a secretary at his, Harry's, expense. How well he knew my husband. Martin objected to anything that might suggest we were living pretentiously or high on the hog. While we were talking, a familiar voice called on the other line. "Mrs. King, this is Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The president wasn't able to talk to you because he's with our father, who is quite ill. He wanted me to call to find out how we can help." I expressed my concern for his father's illness, but then I poured out our situation, trying to make it clear that I was only calling out of concern for Martin's safety and not trying to get him released from jail. Bobby told me how sorry he and the president were about what was happening with Martin, but said that they themselves had trouble dealing with Bull Connor. Bobby promised to do his best to help, however. After hanging up, I felt encouraged. I remembered that it was Easter, and my spirit began to lift. This was the first Sunday in my adult life that I had not been to church. I turned on the radio and listened to a church service. As I thought about it, my understanding of Easter seemed to expand. I was lonely, worried, and depressed, and I thought that maybe Martin felt the same way. Yet what I was experiencing was nothing compared to the suffering of our Lord Jesus Christ. Through his suffering, Christians were redeemed. Somehow I knew that Martin's and my suffering would not be in vain. It was constructive suffering that would help bring down the walls of segregation. It was not happenstance, but meaningful suffering to help people, both black and white, reach a higher purpose. Jesus had been crucified, but in the end, he triumphed. I encouraged myself to hold on to my faith that what I was going through was meaningful too. At about 5 o'clock the next evening, I heard 2-year-old Dexter babbling away into the phone. I picked up the receiver and heard an exasperated operator say, "Will you please get that child off the phone?" The next voice I heard was President Kennedy's. He told me that he had sent the FBI into Birmingham to check on Martin's situation, and he assured me he's all right. After hanging up, I felt such relief. About 15 minutes later, Martin called. Martin always fasted for strength before going to jail, and his voice sounded tired and lifeless. I told him about my conversation with the president, and a smile returned to his voice. I learned that after my call, he had been allowed to take a shower and been given a pillow and a mattress. While in prison, Martin wrote his famed treatise, Letter from a Birmingham jail. He wrote it on the margins of newspapers and on scraps of toilet paper. For some reason, some of the world's most powerful writings have been penned by leaders imprisoned for political causes. There is something about the confinement, the isolation and unjustness of those prisoners' situations that helps focus their minds on their principles. With little left to lose, their bodies already imprisoned, there is nothing left to do but state their principles unequivocally, what they will live and die for. Just as Apostle Paul wrote the prison epistles, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, strengthening believers while being scourged and put in stocks in Roman jails, Martin found the strength while suffering to challenge white clergy to speak out against racial injustice. Finally, I felt well enough to fly. Juanita Abernathy and I flew to Birmingham to visit our husbands, and on Saturday, April 20th, they were released. Shortly thereafter, in response to the invitation of SCLC staffers James Bevel, Andy Young, Dorothy Cotton, and Bernard Lee, thousands of black high school and college students attended mass meetings and training sessions on the philosophy of nonviolence, and then marched through Birmingham in what would come to be known as the Children's Crusade. Naturally, the press, which had not criticized the segregated social system for abusing black children, accused the movement of exploiting the children. But neither the negative media attention nor the arrests dampened the marchers' enthusiasm. Somehow they understood that the movement was about them. Their numbers were being arrested, but they kept marching wave after wave until nearly 1,000 children were locked up. For the first time in the civil rights movement, we were able to put into effect the Gandhian principle of filling the jails to obtain justice. Heartfelt, heroic scenes like those of the marching children, however, only increased the venom coming our way from Bull Connor. On May 3rd, as 1,000 children and teenagers marched toward the police, Connor ordered his troopers to open their water hoses. Jets of water, at hundreds of pounds of pressure, knocked down children, ripping off the clothes of some. Then Connor unleashed the police dogs. Some of the snarling beasts ran through the crowd, biting the legs and arms of children. 2 days later, on May 5th, came an unforgettable and astonishing development. Reverend Charles Billups led a group of adults from the New Pilgrim Baptist Church to the police barricade. As they knelt in prayer, Connor ordered the dogs loosed and the hoses turned on. Connor shouted, "Turn on the hoses, damn it!" But a miraculous thing happened. As the black people rose from their knees, Connor's men fell back to each side, their hoses sagging in their hands. A force stronger than their hoses was working. It was a soul force, what Gandhi called satyagraha, a moral power outweighing physical pressure. Under the eyes of a watching world, the spiritual force of that little band of blacks broke through the ranks of the armed police. Billups led his people past the police, singing. As they knelt in prayer, the police froze in their tracks, disarmed by our nonviolent army. On Friday, May 10th, an agreement was announced that accepted most of our demands word for word. The stores were to be desegregated, hiring of African Americans upgraded, charges against protesters dropped, and the Senior Citizens Committee of the Chamber of Commerce would meet regularly with black leaders to reconcile their differences. Nonetheless, the terror of Birmingham didn't end there. The night after the agreement was signed, the home of Martin's brother, A.D., who was a pastor in Birmingham, was bombed twice. When the first bomb exploded, A.D. grabbed his wife Naomi and pulled her safely into a back room, just as a second bomb blew off the whole front of the house. Still another bomb blew up the office of the Gaston Motel, where Martin had been staying. Hardly 4 months would pass before 4 little girls, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Addie Mae Collins, were killed when a bomb hit the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, the very church where Martin had preached to the children only months before. When they died, They had just finished listening to their Sunday school lessons and were in the ladies' lounge in the basement, freshening up. Like many parents, I thought of those children as my own. What could be more evil than bombing children in church on a Sunday morning? Overall, however, Birmingham was a victory, a high point in our movement. We forged a rough and blood-drenched road, but Martin never looked for easy victories. I learned from him the value of searching for the worst cases, of allowing people to catch the spiritual dimension of their struggle and victory. The way I see it, Birmingham was so evil that only God could change it. And God did. Never before had black people taken such unified, direct action to change the conditions of their lives. On the significance of those days, Martin wrote, "I like to believe that Birmingham will one day become a model in Southern race relations, that the negative extremes of Birmingham's past will resolve into the positive and utopian extreme of her future, that the sins of a dark yesterday will be redeemed in the achievements of a bright tomorrow. I have this hope because once on a summer day, a dream came true. The city of Birmingham discovered a conscience." At that time, it required a great leap of faith to believe in Martin's words, in his hope for Birmingham to radically change. Although Martin never saw what his prophetic words proclaim, I was fortunate enough to see his dream come true.
Context of White Supremacy. That's where we will end this week. We will pick up next Friday. We'll be right at the beginning of Chapter 11. For this week, if you have commentary that you would like to share, the number to dial, 641-715-3640. The code 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. We have a little more than a half hour, so if you have commentary you would like to share, please do not wait till the last minute. Go ahead and get a hand up if you have commentary you would like to share with us. Folks that we did not get to hear from at all, I think that would include Emma. She should be with us. The caller at 6900, you both should be with us. I guess we'll nab MA first, since we do female callers first.
Greetings, everybody. Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to be as honest as possible. I appreciate listening to Miss Coretta Scott King story and her perspective. The romanticism of this book is kind of giving me high blood pressure because I think it is just, for me, very distracting. And I'm grateful in the same way for Miss Gwen Eiffel's book because there's a lot that I did not know. So I'm able to learn a lot of things and put together a picture of history that helps me to better understand racism, white supremacy, because I don't actually know a lot of who certain people they are and what they did. Like, I had no idea that Robert Kennedy or John F. Kennedy, one of the Kennedys, called on behalf of Dr. King, and certain little details like that, that are very important to understanding. For me, racism, white supremacy, but the romanticism of this book is not something that I'm enjoying at all. I do appreciate as a female, but also a human being, because I think it oftentimes gets put on females and women that we're the only ones that want family and children and stuff, and that's not true at all. But I do appreciate being able to hear a black female's perspective who was dedicated to doing something about the system of racism, white supremacy, and how she's handling the responsibilities of being a wife, a mother, and someone dedicated to doing something about racism, white supremacy, and someone who's dedicated to being an individual in the sense that there's something that fulfills them outside of who they are as, as a mother, as a wife, and so forth. I remember listening to that same theme in Ms. Gwen Eiffel's book, The Breakthrough, hearing the struggle that Black women had and being superwomen, which is something I'll share this too. I remind myself often, I am not superwoman. I think that is something that has been placed on Black women, and for me, it is unhealthy. It gives me so much anxiety to feel that I can save everybody or anybody and do all of these things. So I am not superwoman. So I remember she said something about that. There was a moment when she said that the negotiations, I feel like this is similar to the use of metaphor, and that it does not speak directly to the system of racism, white supremacy, and that word choice is extremely important. It's not that the negotiations failed or they failed to keep their end of the deal or the bargain, but that they lied and had no intention of keeping their end of the bargain, in which case they manipulated, played, practiced racism, however you want to word it, that I think is more constructive. I'm not really sure what it is, but I have two things, and then I'll be good, or I'll be complete. The first is I can understand now why so many people, so many non-white people, specifically Black people, think that there's such thing as political. You can be a professional activist. In this time period, I didn't realize this is where that entire notion kind of comes from. That this is what I do, this is how I make my money, this is who I am, and it seems as though white people were very successful in creating that. It's a way of just maintaining the system. We can have a group of Black people that we groom to fight against this, appearingly or seemingly fight against the system without actually really ending the system, so we can amalgamate them in a sense. But we control what they think and how they move and what they think is possible, and so that we can at least still have our thing. And so I've been looking at that, and then BGQ, but the idea that we have to continuously suffer over and over and over again to make white people, I guess, look in the mirror and see themselves as being racist and this is supposed to end things. Hearing it, sometimes when I hear it, I'm like, okay, I can totally see that. But sometimes, no, it just kind of sounds a little bit like insanity. And so I'm viewing this as a case study a little bit to see, wow, not just of Miss King or Dr. King, but how effective white people are at kind of programming the mind to do insane things, particularly the non-white Black mind, because that's kind of what I'm seeing, what I feel. I just want to be in jail and suffer, and that's just what we should do in hopes that, we can all shop in the same store. I don't know. It seems insane to me, but if there's time later, I'll comment. So thank you all for listening. Much appreciated.
Mm-hmm. The caller at, last four digits, 6900. 6900. Did you have commentary?
Yes, good evening, Gus. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, good evening, Gus, the callers, the listeners. This is Jay from New York. A lot of commentary. Kind of glad that Emmy went first because I was kind of feeling the same thing in reference just to the sentiment of, I guess, just this overjoyed sense of connection to this white supremacist system and kind of being accepted into it. There was one part that Mrs. King referenced when she, I guess, was asked to join the women's movement. And the joy that I got when I read the passage, when she said that she would be joined by women from Scandinavia, Switzerland, Soviet Union. And it was just kind of this, wow, I've made it kind of thing. And that was a little troubling for me, just kind of hearing that, because I just thought that, and to Emmy's point in reference to the grooming. As I read this book in the earlier chapters, and we always talk about how they do things, not just, in the last 30 days, that they do things for hundreds of years in terms of their planning. And I could see it, I could see it reading this book in terms of the planning, just thinking about, Daddy King and the large church that he had, and Dr. Martin Luther King, and how he was probably groomed, and how they probably looked at him as someone that they could poise to put in this position. And just as you talked about earlier with the Time magazine, that's not something that they're going to do with someone that's just been around the scene for 30 years. I feel like that's something that they put on someone that they've been grooming for, like, even before he even knew that he was being groomed. Probably the same thing with Mrs. King, with her story at Antioch, and just how everything played into, now there were trials and tribulations, yes, but, and a lot of them, but something just seemed so NAACP involvement, and we know the history of the NAACP. It's just, I'm learning a lot, though, so it's very constructive. One of the things that I haven't heard anyone mention, and if someone has any information, because I tried to do some research on this as well, is I never heard anything about the hundreds, and we heard 500 people jailed in 3 days. There was another 1,000 children that were jailed, and then another 500 people that were jailed. Now, as we think about people being jailed, the charges, the fees, the court costs, the bail fees, all these things that come out of individuals that have to go into the system and then come out, I'm just thinking about the amount of money that these towns must have made every time there was a movement, a protest that happened in their area. I'm thinking that these people probably use this as a revenue stream. Like they said, hey, we could get these folks in, have them do a protest over the weekend and jail 1,000 of them and probably make enough money for the entire year just on those charges of the fees, bail, and everything else. Knowing the system and knowing the methodology of their thought process, I don't see that being above what they would do. I haven't heard anybody bring that up or even saw that in history in terms of the amount of cost that this kind of placed on people who already didn't have a lot of money. But that was something that kind of really started sticking out to me, just hearing about the number of people that were jailed, let out, put back in, let out, put back in. And again, going back to the money and the finances, again, Mrs. King traveling overseas and doing that trip for the women's movement. And we also, I think the firefighter mentioned about Dr. King's trips, but those were trips, he took trips with Mrs. King together, and then he took tons of trips on his own. So again, it kind of brings me back to the point that I made, I guess, last week in reference to Mrs. King's dad being able to kind of continually just find additional funds and finances to get new homes, new businesses. That's kind of just drawing a question mark in my mind, because during this period, where were people just coming up with this refinancing of funds to do the things that they were doing? But again, like I said, it's great context because it's really putting me into the time frame which I wasn't able to connect to where we are today. So those are my thoughts. I'll mute my line for now.
Appreciate that, sir. Some of the other folks that we have not heard from at all. So the caller at 5771. Caller at 5771. Did you have commentary you wanted to share?
Yes. Just quickly, the language that she used about Birmingham was right on point. Terrorism, evil, and one thing that she mentioned was about Governor George Wallace, where he mentioned segregation now, segregation forever, and whatever. But, you know, it didn't seem like they were segregated because white people just kept terrorizing and killing black folks. And so I'm like thinking, like, was there real segregation there? So I would like to basically kind of change what he really meant was white supremacy now and white supremacy forever. So that's all I wanted to say. I'll mute my line.
Right on. The person that dialed in last four digits, 3637. Caller at 3637. Did you have commentary you wanted to share?
Yes, hello everyone. I wanted to make a note of how JFK was called in to get Martin Luther King a pillow and a mattress, and how white people can just sit there and still practice racism while they front in your face like they're not practicing racism, because he couldn't stop the bombings or the killings or the lynchings in Birmingham or anywhere else, but he got there and got Martin Luther King Jr. a pillow and a mattress and a phone call in the shower. And I'll mute my line.
Whites have the ability to stop practicing white supremacy right now. They just choose not to. The caller, did we miss you? The caller at 5410, did you have commentary? Caller at 5410, did you have commentary? Oh, I think this person is just listening. Got it. I think I might have nabbed all the folks that we missed the first time around. So everybody else, Mr. Demery Ford, retired firefighter, the other folks from the first time around, if you have commentary you would like to share, feel free. Line should be open.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Someone spoke about this before in the second half, just bringing some more to the discussion. Basically, Dr. King's strategy, from my understanding, was to fill the jails up, and in turn, it would cost the city a lot of money. Therefore, they would go to a period of negotiating over the matters that the non-white people were speaking about in the first place. Also, there was knowledge, especially in Birmingham, from my understanding, that there was going to have to be some change anyway. That's normally how things go on a global basis under the system of racist white supremacy. The white people are going to change anyway, but they just sit around, so to speak, and force the non-white people, in this case non-white black people, to take all of the risk. At one point in time, Birmingham was the number one steel place in this part of the world, in the southern part of what's called the United States, and that was going. I think that was going away. So after the 1940s, from my understanding, I could be wrong, but I think it had. I know it was very important in steel at the time, and so changes were on the horizon anyway. Just so to speak, just like I said, strategy-wise, white people make us take all of the risk in order for those things to come about. It was only, but what started happening in and around the mid-'60s, there was a police chief by the name, his last name was Pritchett, that gained access to Dr. King's strategy and started undermining it to whereas it was somewhere in Tennessee, I believe, where he was forced to have to leave the city because he was taking this strategy all around this part of the world, and until he was abruptly defeated. Talking about Dr. Martin Luther King, and in turn he started going through other things. I took some notes, and the first one, number one, was the complications of black males and black females getting along under the system of racist white supremacy. As Mr. Fuller says, the best thing that black males and black females can do under the global system of racist white supremacy is make agreements. As far as that concerned. Number two, I have, by this time, under the Kennedy administration, and it ended up being also the Johnson administration, due to giving financial and sometimes enforcement and sometimes legal support. They was giving that to Dr. King. In turn, these national figures national powerful white figures in this part of the world was gaining the undeserved trust from a whole lot of non-white people, and was actually looking good to the world. That's what they were cultivating all the while. Maybe at the unknowledge of Dr. Martin Luther King and his wife. All of that went away when Dr. King actually really started having a more understanding of the global system of racist white supremacy, when he started speaking out against the Vietnam War. And in turn, as we all know, he didn't live longer than 12 months after he made that famous speech in 1967. He was murdered. Number three, Dr. King, in my opinion, was purposely showcased to neutralize, in order for white people to neutralize that particular effort of counter-racism. History tells us they were successful in that. I have down here Walter Fauntroy. I knew personally his brother, Ray Fauntroy, who ended up being one of the last officials of the Southern Christian Leader Conference. And last but not least, number five, I have down here, after all of that we hear, and we'll probably hear a little bit more about George Wallace. Yes, unfortunately, non-white black people forgave him also, like Gillian Roof. And that's all I have for right now. Thank you.
Appreciate that, retired firefighter. Other folks who are with us, thank Mr. Dummy Ford. Did you have commentary you wanted to share?
Yes, may I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Mrs. King started off, she said the winds of change was blowing, and sometimes in our favor and sometimes not. And like the female caller, I guess Emmy, was saying how Mrs. King was juggling motherhood and freedom fighter and advocate. But this about having children, while, you had a knowledge of the way the system was working, and it was being revealed to her, and in a sense of helplessness that she felt, in the inability to protect the family, you would, think, why, keep having kids or children. But then it brings up the fact of what types of birth control was available during that time, I guess the early 60s, and then the religious views that they probably had as far as pro-life or right to life. It's just food for thought that, you, even now that you would, once you have a knowledge of the system, the way things work, you'd be hesitant about bringing life into a situation like this. But then if the whites throwing rocks at the church, they have no sense of, you know what I'm saying, civility when it comes to sacred beliefs, others other than whites. And breaking out the stained glass windows, and if somebody hadn't called, like you said, some powerful white person, that mob that was gathering around the church would have killed them and burnt the church down also. It's amazing what extent these white officials went to resist civil disobedience or any type of civil rights movements. When they were forced to integrate, then they closed down the restaurants and closed the parks, libraries, just so that blacks wouldn't have access to them. And she had to carry a lunch around because you never knew, if you got hungry, you couldn't go in a restaurant and order anything. Whites would not serve blacks. Bull Connors did the same thing, closing public offices and denying black citizens rights. And it was a shame. The AD was Dr. King's brother. You know, his house was bombed twice, as if once wouldn't be enough to totally terrify or probably kill you. But I saw somewhere that, you know, whites, when they make these strikes, they make another immediate strike to get even the first responders. So I'll mute my line on that. Thanks for taking the call.
Right on. Anybody that we missed completely? Anybody have a hand up that we have not heard at all? Awesome. Soon we got everybody. Some of the quick notes that I had, see if we need time for anybody else to get a final word in. I think I had the same observation about when she talked about joining the Women's Strike for Peace, this group founded in 1961. I assume these are some white people joining them. It almost reminded me of the Women's March earlier this year, even though I did hear a good bit of pushback from non-white females about wanting to join, to go arm in arm, marching to the nation's capital with white women, given their participation in white supremacy. But that perhaps being white validation, and again, looking for good white people to be a part of that organization. Just thought it was amazing black self-restraint, black self-respect to hear about the black maids going to jail under assumed names to keep from being fired by their white employers. That was a very common practice all throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even today, when they have had reports about people being followed on Twitter, looking for certain hashtags, if they use Black Lives Matter or another hashtag like that, and being tracked online. But black people at this time, if you were a part of a protest or a boycott, or you were arrested, or you were a member of the NAACP, you could be fired or denied a loan or anything. Just massive terrorism. In fact, that was itself an act of racism. In some places, whites would just go and try to get the roster of members for the local NAACP or SCLC or whatever branch, and just publish it in the paper so that whites would know all the niggers that they need to go, extra hard on. I thought we talk about this all the time, and speaking honestly with your children about racism, where she said to avoid explaining why we had to go in the back door of a restaurant, to avoid being called nigger, I always packed our lunch. We also tried to avoid stopping at segregated restrooms. I think there are a number of stories. In fact, I think in the Spike Lee documentary, Four Little Girls, which I think Coretta Scott King is in, she talks about, or some of the parents of the victims of the Birmingham church bombing, they talk about the same thing, that they would go out and trying to avoid this, that we can't eat here, or we can't go here, or you can't do this, you can't do that, and having to explain this to your children, and what to say, or how long can we put this off before we have to explain what all this means. I think one of the parents, in fact, I think he gives a very poignant anecdote where he talks about it was one of the most painful things he had to experience as a parent, trying to tell his daughter, who was ultimately killed in the bombing, that she, I guess, wanted a sandwich at a restaurant and she couldn't have it because they didn't serve niggers, and he had to explain that to her. He said that was one of the most painful things memories that he carries with him to this day. I thought we talk about, or at least I talk about this all the time, whites value white supremacy more than justice. They value racism, white supremacy more than anything, and in fact will engage in self-harm if it means denying niggers. And I try to point these examples out frequently because I think that reveals a deeper level of pathology amongst whites, where you would rather close the public schools than to have a nigger at the school. University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, James Meredith will probably pop up in this book, where they have one nigger at the University of Ole Miss, and whites are killing other white people. They're on a rampage. They almost have to close down the whole university. She talks about Albany officials closed down city parks and the public library. as opposed to me coming in here and sitting down next to any niggers and reading a book. We'll just close the library, period. Nobody will read. Like, wow. I mean, that's what I mean about it, and I can totally get it. If that's the level of terrorism that we're dealing with, then I too, it is difficult to have some sort of Pollyanna romanticized conversation about this as though whites changed and God Almighty made an Easter miracle and we had redemption and reconciliation. Like, no, that's not what this is at all, and we should be talking about this in terms that accurately reflect what we are, dealing with here. Let's see some of the other things. Oh, in that same paragraph, they talks about where they closed in Albany, Georgia, where they closed the public libraries and city parks. It also says that effective change was hampered by the lack of registered black voters. I just made a note of that because it seems that is a common culprit, allegedly, for many of the problems when people are dealing with racism. Somehow the problem will end up being we don't have black voters, or they're not registered to vote, or they didn't vote. That even came up that it was black people's fault about President Trump. Somehow that always is our fault, and I staunchly reject that. I'm not saying in terms of voting in an election or what have you, I'm not saying there's anything incorrect about that or not to do it. I'm just saying that I think that gets overstated a lot, that is the culprit. Continuing. Let's see. This notion, because it came up again, where she says the media, and I talked about that last time, where white people can be very skillful at projecting or anointing, because that's the word she used, Martin as president of Black America, whatever that means, on the plantation, where white people can put a lot of attention on you. Same thing, we talked about this since Glenn Eiffel's book was mentioned with President Obama. I think some of the same things where they got him in all these magazines and what have you and get all this attention on you that, hey, this is the person that you should follow. This is the person who is going to get black folks straight, take them where they need to be. Let's see. Next, I really, really appreciated just talking about the accurate use of terms in chapter 10, where she says Birmingham was notorious for ordinary day-to-day terrorism. She didn't say racism or discrimination, terrorism. Accurate terms to describe what it is we're talking about. I also thought it was important when she mentioned Fred Shuttlesworth, where he was chain whipped on a public street by a white mob in 1957. Not ancient history, 1957, same year as the Little Rock Nine, when they integrated schools in Arkansas. I cannot even imagine. If he was trying to enroll his children at public school, I was thinking that this public chain whipping could have happened in front of his children, and his wife was stabbed in front of enforcement officials. I mean, is this ordinary day-to-day terrorism? Chain whipping niggers in the street in Alabama in 1957 was an ordinary everyday event. This is just what we do. You set your clock. We have our nigger chain whippings every day at noon, high noon. I mean, wow. I mean, it is almost difficult to fathom. But I mean, that is racism, white supremacy. And I mean, really, you talk about all the police videos and everything else. That's kind of what we have today, 2017. But that is the reality of racism, white supremacy. I think I can rest there. I guess if I was going to get in one other thing, the Antioch College, because she seems like she has such fond memories of her days at Antioch. She referenced that a number of times this week. We talked about it last week. She and her sister attending there. She didn't mention the name of the president, and Dr. Welsing didn't mention either when she talked about this on the program, and shame on Gus for not asking, well, what was the name of the president? While you were there, I checked, and by my calculations, it would have been Algo Henderson. He was the president of Antioch College from 1936 to 1947. That would have been the time that Coretta Scott King was there. She was there a little bit before Dr. Welsing. I'd have to go back to look at the date again to see when Dr. Welsing, when she got there, when she left. But Mr. Henderson was there from 36 to 47. I think he would have been the one who would have been there when Coretta Scott King was there, so it would have been Mr. Henderson, presumably, who would have had the black dog named Nigger. if anybody wants to do any research. I'd be curious if anyone has responded, because it seems like there's a relationship, like Antioch, they do their bragging that, this is one of our famous alumni. This institution is Coretta Scott King. So I'd be curious if anyone has responded. Has anyone verified that, yes, this is true? President of Antioch College did have a black dog named Nigger, and Coretta Scott King is not the only one to have mentioned this. I'd be curious if anybody wants to do any research on that. With that is 3 hours. We should wrap there. We'll pick up next week again on chapter 11. Next week, chapter 11, which is the I Have a Dream speech. So that'll be grand for next week. Everyone come prepared, thinking caps ready to learn and evaluate. We'll be here tomorrow, compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. We'll review what's gone down last 7 days. And we'll be here on Sunday, the Global Sunday Talk on Racism. Should have our listeners joining from various spots on the globe to review, catch up on what has gone down the past month from an international perspective. If you have any thoughts, comments on the book, we can share. We have a significant chunk of reading left to do, so feel free to email if you have a comment to share as we continue through a very provocative read, My Life, My Love, My Legacy, Mrs. Coretta Scott King. With that, thanks everyone for tuning in. All of the callers, great to hear from everyone. Hope it was a constructive investment of your Friday evening. I will state again, sobriety would be best under conditions of white supremacy. Race soldiers are out and about. If you can hear about them snatching Dr. King up and throwing him in the back of a police car with a German Shepherd, I don't think him being under the influence is going to make that situation any easier. I don't think that's going to make it enable him to more quickly get back home to his wife and children. In my view, I think there's a lot of evidence, us being under the influence, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, whatever the other narcotics are, a lot of evidence that all of that has dramatically aided race soldiers like the great Bull Connor in continuing to stomp on and terrorize black people. I think our brain computer, and I suspect Mrs. Coretta Scott King would probably co-sign, I think we would do better to try being sober, see if we can come up with solutions, concepts to the problem: racist man, racist woman, racist child. With that, Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of white supremacy. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cow signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim.
Yeah. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.